And welcome to the 31st meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019. Can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones? We've received apologies from Kenneth Gibson this morning. Agenda item 1 is consideration of the Draft Planning Scotland Act 2019 Ancillary Provision Regulations 2019. The committee will first take evidence on the instrument, and I welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, and Jean Waddy, Planning Reform Coordinator, Scottish Government.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to you all. These regulations simply correct some cross-referencing and typographical errors in the Act. They are subject to affirmative procedure because they amend the text of the primary legislation. And I'll leave it at that, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any questions from members? Andy?
Yes, I'm just wondering how often corrections have to be made to primary legislation.
I, off the top of my head, cannot answer that question, Convener. Ms Waddy has been involved in a number of bills and may have an idea of some of the ones that she's dealt with in the past, but I can't answer that question straight off. Do you want to?
I couldn't say specifically. As you know, there were a lot of changes to this bill, so there was a lot of back and forth, and a few things were just missed as we went along.
But you'd accept, Minister, when errors are made, we should accept them with good grace and deal with them.
I think that when you have made typographical errors and things like that, that should be accepted with good grace. If you're missing huge elements out of an amendment, for example, or not taking due cognizance of the unintended consequences of putting something forward, then I think that's somewhat different.
Okay. Seriously?
It's just really to assist Mr Whiteman. So as convener of the DPLR committee, all these things come through our committee. And to be fair to the government, the number of, let's call them mistakes that have cropped up, that we pick up, has been reducing under the watchful eye of Graham Day, who will be appearing before us very soon.
Thank you very much for that.
Convener, if I can just say, in fairness to the bill team who worked exceptionally hard, this was a bill, now an act, which had a huge amount of amendments, and at stage 3, a number of things which came back. And what we're talking about here are a few minor errors. I know that Mr Simpson takes keeps a very close eye on all of this from his committee. I think these are very, very minor indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
On that basis, we'll move on to agenda item 2. The formal consideration of the motion S5M 19958, calling for the Local Government and Communities Committee to recommend approval of the Draft Planning Scotland Act 2019 Ancillary Provision Regulations 2019. Minister?
I move, Convener.
Thank you. Any contributions from members? No. In that case, I invite the ministers to... No, I don't invite you to do anything except for... I'll put the question. The question is that motion S5M 19958, the name of the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, be approved. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
That is agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. The committee will report on this instrument in due course. And I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'll take a short intermission to let the panel move. At agenda item 3, the committee will consider the Non-Domestic Rates Scotland Bill at stage 2, day 2. And I once again welcome Kate Forbes, Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, to talk and move amendments on behalf of the Scottish Government. I also welcome her officials. Also welcome Liz Smith today, who has amendments for this morning. The intention is to finish stage 2 today, and hopefully we have good enough time to do so. I call Amendment 73 in the name of Liz Smith, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Liz Smith to move Amendment 73 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. And can I move Amendment 73 and also speak to the other amendments within this group? Amendment 73 is very much about the equality of charities, which is an issue that was raised by Mr Martin Tyson of Oscar when he gave evidence to your committee on the 19th of June. And he said, and I quote, "Our concern is that this proposal about Section 10 goes to the basis of what the charity law in Scotland says a charity is. For a long time, the assumption has been that any tax reliefs or rate reliefs apply equally to all charities across the board. There are not some charities that are more charitable than others. Our main concern is that we could start getting a blurring around the edges of what a charity is and not what the public understand a charity to be." And he goes on to say that it's not clear why anybody would want to create that ambiguity, something which would obviously introduce differentiated treatment and therefore be likely to open up a legal challenge. As members know, Section 4 of the Local Government Financial Provisions Scotland Act 1962 provides the reduction and remission of rates payable by charitable and other organisations. And as that stands, that section does not provide for any differentiation in how charities are treated in terms of their eligibility for reduction or remission of rates. So, without Section 10, charities would continue to be treated equally in terms of rates relief. And with that in mind, the amendment below seeks to provide beyond doubt that all charities should be treated equally in terms of rate reliefs. Amendments 74, 75 and 78 are about reliefs for nurseries within independent schools. These three amendments in combination seek to provide that nurseries within the independent schools will still be eligible for rates relief, putting them on an equal footing with private nurseries not within the independent school sector. It's wholly anomalous to make legislation which removes charitable relief on business rates for not-for-profit charitable institutions, yet allows private profit-making nurseries to continue to enjoy rates relief. And I wonder if the Minister, when she comes to respond, if she could explain what logic she considers behind that decision, most especially in terms of the pressure that the Scottish Government is under to deliver its 1140 hours policy, which independent schools obviously contribute to, especially the larger urban day schools. These amendments provide that lands and heritage which are related to the provision of nursery classes within an independent school will be entered separately in the valuation roll and will be eligible for rates relief. Amendments 76 and 77 are about the provision of education to children with additional support needs in mainstream independent schools. These amendments provide that mainstream independent schools will still be eligible for rates relief, provided that they deliver education to pupils with additional support needs who have been selected for a place in the school by reason of those needs. I don't see any reason why their needs should not be classified as being different from those schools currently named a special school. Amendment 79 is to leave out all of Section 10, and the Minister is very well aware of why the independent school sector is so strongly opposed to Section 10, most especially because they do not feel that any comprehensive cost-benefit analysis has been carried out, for which the evidence is the very weak financial memorandum. The Minister persistently says that she values the high standards of education provided by the independent sector, and it is a very important part of Scotland's education system. Indeed, on the previous occasion in 2005, when many of these issues were considered in the Charities and Trustees Investment Scotland Act, there was a much more detailed analysis provided to assess the significant public benefit delivered by Scotland's independent schools, something which resulted in unanimous agreement across the Parliament. If that support remains the case, as the Minister insists it does, and the independent schools in their annual report state as being a total of 51 million out of financial support, then it would surely have been appropriate to carry out an accurate and comprehensive financial memorandum. But it's more than that. This proposed policy move has significant implications for the state sector, and that should not be forgotten in terms of the financial considerations and indeed the availability of places and teaching resources. Of course. Of course.
I hear what the member just said, but I'm a wee bit confused as to why that would be the conclusion here. Why would there be an impact of any particular degree in a negative way on the state school?
Because the state sector would inevitably be asked to take up the placement of children from independent schools whose parents are no longer able to afford the fees. So there would be a dropout from the independent sector, and we know from many of the letters that we've received from heads in the independent sector already that they are anticipating that with fee increases they would lose some of their pupils. Therefore, these pupils have to be educated somewhere, so there is an impact on the state sector as a result of that. I think the Minister is also fully well aware that there are issues about the likely impact on the availability of bursary provision within this, that it could have a detrimental effect on the ability of some of the schools to offer their facilities for these bursaries, but also to offer their other facilities for public benefit. And I think that's particularly true for many of the smaller schools. And to my mind, all of that is a very difficult situation that they face. Without exception, I think there are likely to be very considerable increases on fees, and therefore there are going to be fewer parents who are able to choose independent education. So I think that means that independent education is likely to become more elitist and reduce parental choice, which, to my mind, is the exact opposite of both Scottish Government policy and what this Parliament agreed to in 2005. Amendments 81, 82 and 83 are about the timing of any proposed commencement of Section 10. The first amendment, which is a paving amendment, sets out that the Scottish Government Minister's power to make regulations commencing sections is subject to the provisions of one or other of the two amendments set out below. The second amendment provides, that's 82, provides that regulations bringing the section into force cannot be made until after the next revaluation year, which, as the Minister knows, is 2022. Ministers have already initiated some discussions, I think, about this, and they intimated that they are willing to listen to the sector for a short delay to implementation, and it makes sense to ensure that the start date follows rather than precedes these new revaluations. And the third amendment recognises the provision of the previous amendment, but in addition to these provisions, it provides that the Scottish Ministers must conduct a consultation after the bill receives royal assent and lay a report on that consultation before the Parliament before making the regulations. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Graham Simpson to speak to Amendment 80 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks very much, Convener. Amendment 80 deals with the date when these provisions would come into force, and it's essentially giving the committee an option. If the committee was minded to agree that there should be a delay in bringing this in, you're essentially faced with a choice between Liz Smith's Amendment 82, which would delay it until 2022, as you've already heard, or my Amendment 80, which would simply delay it until the 1st of August 2021, which is the start of the school year. So the thinking there is the start of the school year seems a natural point in terms of a school's business. I much prefer Liz Smith's 82, but I'm giving the committee a slightly softer option, if you like, because we've heard that schools, some independent schools, not all, but some, are in a perilous position, and I'm absolutely certain, because I've heard the Minister say it, that she does not want to see schools close, and I think if we drive forward with the bill as it is, that could be the effect. Certainly some smaller schools could close, and that could lead to the situation that Liz Smith described, is that you've got kids who go to these schools entering the state sector, and of course, as we've already heard, the government sadly has done no financial planning on that at all. So I'm happy to move Amendment 80.
Thank you very much. Andy?
Thanks very much indeed, Convener. I just want to make a few comments on Section 10 of the bill. you know, I support the overall intentions of Section 10. In principle, I believe that all non-domestic properties should pay something. I moved an amendment to that effect last week. It was rejected. And to that extent, independent schools are no different. They, as many other non-domestic properties, benefit from the costs, benefit from local services, and should contribute towards them. However, it is notable that this bill has gone about this in a rather clumsy way, which all derives, in my view, from the very narrow focus of the Barclay Review, which was focused on business performance and asked one question, and that question was focused around business performance, notwithstanding the fact that over a third of non-domestic properties are not occupied by businesses. And that's why, of course, Oscar wasn't really involved in the beginning. And the remit of the review was to be cost neutral. So in order to provide the kind of cost cuts or the tax reductions that it did, it then had to find money to pay for that. So let's put it on record. I think this review was not the comprehensive review that we were promised by John Swinney about 10 years ago now or so. It was a very narrow review, and that's why we're in the place we're in. In terms of the withdrawal of charitable relief, I mean, I've got another issue here, which is, as a matter of principle, I don't believe that any taxpayer, whether you're paying VAT or income tax, non-domestic rates, doesn't matter what it is, should have to face a 4 or 5-fold increase in tax liability almost overnight. Now, I'm aware that the Minister at stage 1 before this committee said she had no settled view on the commencement of Section 10. No decision's been made on that, and no provisions made in the bill on that. I don't believe that the changes brought about by Section 10 should be deferred necessarily, although it was Graham Simpson mentioned the impact in different schools, and it was notable that when this committee had a roundtable event at George Watson's Academy, where a number of independent schools came, quite a lot in fact, we went round the table and they were asked to provide the number of pupils at their school, the cost implications of the withdrawal of the 80% mandatory relief, and I did a quick calculation dividing one by the other, and it was clear that for some, particularly the smaller schools, the impact per pupil would be 5 or 6 or 7 times higher than the impact on larger schools. It was also clear as well that some schools, I remember the Steiner School, are, because this is a tax on the occupation of non-domestic property, the Steiner School has about 250 pupils, but it's got a very, very efficient campus. I think it's basically just 2 detached villas in Morningside or somewhere, and has a relatively low non-domestic rates liability when the relief is withdrawn. Another school, I can't remember what it was, so I won't risk making an error but by naming it, but had a similar pupil roll, but its tax liability was going to be about 3 or 4 times higher because it had a much bigger campus and more buildings. And therefore, there is an issue here, I think, that you have a class of ratepayers here who for many years, certainly since mandatory relief was introduced, have not really paid too much attention to the efficiency with which they occupy their property because they have no rates liability. And therefore, I think there's an argument for phasing in this change, and I'd welcome Minister's comments on that. And finally, moving to Liz Smith's Amendment 75, I think that's grouped with 74 and 78. I agree with these amendments. We'll be supporting them. I mean, ministers indicated at the outset that the purpose of Section 10 and withdrawal of relief was to provide a level playing field between the independent sector and the public sector. Now, if one's going to provide a level playing field, one needs to do that in all circumstances. And I'll move on to discuss that in my own Amendment 15 in the next group. But it seems logical that nurseries that happen to be located within the campuses of independent schools should be eligible for the same rates relief, given that they are the same kind of class of property as nurseries that are located outside. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle?
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. Just picking up on a few of the issues that have been raised thus far. I mean, if we go back to first principles, I mean, the Barclay Review reported in August 2017, okay, and it recommended that mainstream independent schools receive the same rates treatment as state schools. The Scottish Government then indicated that it accepted the recommendations of Barclay, including that recommendation, in December 2017. That is 2 years ago now. Okay, so I think that in terms of the direction of travel, this would not come as a surprise to any interested party. The committee, in its Stage 1 report, noted, and I quote it, para 116, page 36, a majority of the committee supports Section 10 of the bill, by virtue of which mainstream independent schools will no longer be able to claim charitable relief. The committee agrees that this change is necessary to create a level playing field between the state and independent sectors. It will also generate more revenue for councils to spend on services to citizens. And the report went on to say the majority accepts that there will be a financial impact on independent schools, but notes the Scottish Government's view that on average the additional cost would equate to about 1.3% of annual fees. So that is the information that the committee had to hand. And also it's worth noting that in the evidence before the committee, I think the report also states clearly that there was no real evidence of any, that any concerns about the lack of a playing field between the independent sector, mainstream independent sector, and the state sector was motivated at all by any petty desire to get rid of independent schools. The committee report quite clearly stated that there wasn't really any evidence to suggest that on the part of those who had taken the time and trouble to make their submissions known to the committee. So I think that perhaps hopefully clarifies a few myths that may have arisen here. On some of the detail of that, in terms of the suggestion that Liz Smith made that there would be then a whole host of individuals seeking now a placement in the state sector because they cannot afford the fees, if it is the case, as the Minister stated, and presumably will make further comments about this morning, that the average increase would be about 1.3% of annual fees, so that could be maybe £20 per month or something of that order. I don't quite see it would be likely that there would be a huge influx from the mainstream independent sector to the state sector. I don't really think that argument stands much scrutiny. On the issue of whether or not... Yes, I will.
Thanks,
yes.
I'm very grateful. Does Annabelle Ewing not accept that we heard evidence that some schools are already in a very perilous financial position and that bringing this into effect could actually tip them over the edge and could see schools close?
Well, I hear what the member says. I mean, obviously, in the end of the day, if a mainstream independent school is struggling as a matter of economics, they will have to look at their model to see what it is that they could do, just like any other business, to seek to go forward or not, as the case may be. It shouldn't really be a matter of taking money away that could otherwise be spent by the state for the benefit of citizens as a whole. Moving to the argument that somehow independent mainstream schools would stop taking scholarship pupils. Again, I would approach that argument with a degree of caution because, of course, if that were to be the case, they may indeed risk their charitable status. And if they risk their charitable status, they then risk not being able to reclaim VAT, which I think would make a much bigger dent in their budgets than anything else being discussed here. So I think it's important to address these key issues absolutely head on. And therefore, as I had voted in committee at the time of our Stage 1 report, I will not be supporting the amendments to remove the desire to create a level playing field as between the mainstream independent school sector and the state sector. And lastly, on the issue of the independent day nurseries, it would be helpful if the Minister, when making her own contribution, could just clarify exactly where the Scottish Government stands on that issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Sarah and then Alexander.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think there are quite a lot of important issues in these amendments, and I support the principle of Section 10, as my colleagues have done in the past, principally because it's about fair treatment and equal treatment between our schools. But there's quite a few issues I want to ask, and I've been interested in getting colleagues' questions and comments thus far. So I really wanted to focus on three issues. One about relation to the nursery section. sorry, two issues, because I'm coming to Andy Whiteman's amendments later. Firstly, the issue about nurseries, and secondly, the issue of the timing of the introduction of non-domestic rates to private and independent schools. So I want to pick up that question that Annabel has just finished with, which is about why the Scottish Government has not applied the same criteria to private nurseries across Scotland. What is the reason for a different approach between private nurseries and private nurseries, which are in private or independent schools? Surely if we're looking for fair treatment, you would treat them all the same. And I'm particularly interested in what work the Scottish Government has carried out on the potential impact on those nurseries, and indeed why you have applied a different approach here. Secondly, and I think it's probably the big issue here that we're going to discuss, in relation to the issue of timing of the application of non-domestic rates for private schools. What consideration has the Scottish Government given to the issue of the timing of the implementation of the removal? And can you clarify whether the impact would mean that schools could be subject to paying non-domestic rates without knowing what they are in next year, in April? As I understand it, this bill goes through early 2020. When is this effect going to kick in? You've got we're sitting here with two options in front of us, a softer option as it was put by Graham Simpson, a slightly longer option by Liz Smith, but we don't actually, well, I don't know exactly when this bill will kick in. If it's passed, when does this section of the bill commenced? Is this intended to be done with secondary legislation, or is the passing of this bill, does that mean that the rates automatically apply? And I think I take a lot of Annabel's points about this has been a clear government intention for quite a while. I suppose that doesn't mean the same thing in terms of people knowing exactly what those rates would be and how you would plan for it if you've already set your fees. So I'm interested in the impact assessment, specifically halfway through a school year, if it was 2020. There have been reports that not all schools remain viable, and I particularly want to pick up to develop the points a couple of colleagues have raised about impact on state schools. And I particularly want to just ask the issue about Edinburgh. 24% of students in Edinburgh go to private schools. So I just want to check that all these issues have been looked at properly and what the local impact for the schools would be. Because I do welcome the fact that there'll be more money going to local authorities. Just make the point it does not automatically mean that that money goes to schools, because given the crisis in local government funding, that's not automatic. So I just want to tease out those issues and get the Minister's views and comments about that, because I think the timing and impact on schools is important, because while we want fairer treatment, as ministers have said earlier, you don't want unintended consequences. So I'd just like to explore those in a bit more depth. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Alexander?
And yes, Convener, if I can follow on from that, I think it's vitally important that we get some of the clarity from the Minister about what the impact would be. I mean, Liz Smith has brought forward these amendments in good faith because, as we already heard from the sector, when we met with the sector, the impact on them could be catastrophic for some of the schools. They had themselves done some analysis about the impacts that would take place, and we got that information when we met with them when we had our event at George Watson's College that day. And for some of the small ones, as my colleagues already have indicated, that was massive, or could be massive for them to manage that. And also taking on board the comments about local authorities. Edinburgh has been identified, but places like Perth and Kinross are also an area that has a large percentage of school population that may well go to independent schools, and that would have and could have a massive knock-on effect within the sector for the council to manage. And as we already know, in a number of those schools and across the location, the level of attendance is at breaking point already, without having to add in. And Perth and Kinross have put in a brand new school, the first new high school that's been introduced into the area for 40 years. But that itself will only manage to take on board what we have with the population increase, rather than any knock-on effect that may well come from the schools not managing to survive and thrive. So I think that's important, and also that the nursery provision in a private school, that is vitally important, that there is not that bias or unfairness for the sector to ensure that they can compete. So it would be useful to get some of that information from the Minister as well. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just ask before I let the Minister back in, is it not true that at no stage in the evidence did we get the feeling that there was going to be a huge influx of pupils from the independent sector to the state sector. I mean, I get that there may well be, but some, but there was never any suggestion at all that there was going to be a huge influx of people going from the independent sector to the state sector. Well, I suppose it's more a point. Unless I was waiting to see if any said, no, wait a minute, Mr. So-and-so said.
I would agree with the convener on that point. I think if we look back through all the evidence, I think that's a fair point. I understand, you know, trying to make arguments for an amendment, you know, you do your best and whatever, but it's less compelling, that argument, I think, given the evidence received.
I think the problem, convener, has been no analysis done. That was the issue with the bill. There was no analysis done. We can expect some pupils to go into the state sector, but no, you're right, we don't know the numbers. That's the problem.
Yeah. Okay, I'll let the Minister in now. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Convener. There's a lot in that, and I'd like to speak to the substance of the amendments. I'd like to talk about the government's intentions, and I'd like to answer the question. So I'm assuming that members will intervene if they feel I haven't done so. So before I turn to the amendments, I want to put on record once again that I recognise that not all members support the government's intentions in this area. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, that we recognise that the independent school sector is a well-established part of the Scottish education system that promotes choice for our parents. We have no intention of using these pieces of legislation to go any further than we have stated. This is not a cover for anything else. We acknowledge that, yeah.
I think everybody accepts that, Minister. I mean, you have said, and I've listened very carefully to previous ministers, there is no intention to abolish the sector. The point here is that this bill, not least because some of it has not been worked through effectively with the cost-benefit analysis, it does have the intention to bring about significant constraints on the sector, and particularly for some of the smaller independent schools, some of which, well, we know that we've already seen one closure, and we know that there will be pressures on that. So that's the concern. Nobody's saying to the Minister that we don't...
Thank you. No, I appreciate that clarification. I think it's important that I state that out at the outset, though, because there are some fears that this is just the start of a number of actions, which is not the case. And I think it's important to state that, and then I'll respond to some of the concerns that have been identified. I think it's important too to state, to Andy Whiteman's point, that there is a variety of impacts on the schools. So the independent school sector is very varied. There are some very substantial large schools who can probably, and I'll go through the figures in a minute, absorb some of the impacts better than some of the other schools. And I think Andy Whiteman made that point very well. And I certainly, over the course of the last year, have been in conversation, have looked at different scenarios of how we ensure that through this legislation we try and avoid any unintended consequences through the legislation. But we can come on to the substance of the points that have been identified. I think the last point I would make as a opening caveat is that independent schools are facing a variety of constraints and difficulties. Pension impacts, for example, are just one of the many costs that they are trying to absorb at the moment. This impact, and there will be some form of impact, we think is very minimal in comparison with the other impacts that are being faced. But of course that will differ for schools on the basis of their size and their resources. So those are my caveats. And like I said, I recognise that some members do not support these changes. I respect that position, but I disagree with that. And we have agreed to the Barclay review that the current difference in rates treatment between independent and local authority schools should come to an end. Now, if I may, I will go through the amendments one by one and perhaps finish with some of the questions around the financial impacts. So if I go to Amendment 73 to begin with, which of course clarifies the eligibility of charities for relief under Section 4 of the Local Government Act 1962 by suggesting that they're always eligible for relief. Now, I would argue that Section 4 is already sufficiently clear. It's clear that all charities can obtain relief if they meet the two tests set out in the section, that a property must be occupied by a charity or a trustee of a charity, and the property must be used wholly or mainly for charitable purposes. In terms of Liz Smith's intention, I think actually what's already there in the wording meets that intention and actually adds nothing to what's already in the Act.
Just intervene. In terms of your discussions with Oscar prior to putting these proposals forward, can I ask what discussions you had with Oscar? Because it's quite a strong comment that Mr Tyson made at committee, where he feels that this would be opening up the possibility of different levels of charity.
Well,
what discussions did you have about that?
Well, in terms of the legislation, you're right in saying that the way it works is that that sets out up front the definition, and then the Act makes the provision for exemptions to that, and that's where the exemption would apply to charitable relief.
Right. What discussions did you have with Oscar about this?
And in terms of Oscar, Barclay offered all stakeholders, including Oscar, the opportunity to discuss these issues. Yeah.
Is it not correct to say that you had no discussions with Oscar?
We accepted the Barclay recommendations. The Barclay recommendations included the offer of discussions with Oscar. And in terms of that particular amendment, the amendment that Liz Smith refers to does not add anything to what's already in the bill. Now, that may be an error on the part of drafting, but it does not add anything to what's already in the bill. In terms of Amendments 74, 75 and 78, and those seek to allow independent nursery schools to apply for day nursery relief where they're located as part of an independent primary or secondary school campus, members will know that we accepted the Barclay Review recommendation that we introduce a day nursery relief, which would help more of the workforce to return to work. Now, we agreed and we have moved quickly to introduce a day nursery relief from the 1st of April 2018. Now, that 100% relief is available for a 3-year period to standalone nurseries, whether in the private, the public or the third sector. There is a level playing field already between the private, the public and the third sector in terms of accessing that relief. And in 1819, around 700 such nurseries benefited from almost £10 million of relief. Now, many private and third sector nurseries are standalone nurseries, and those nurseries working in partnership with local authorities have a vital role to play, ensuring that there is a sufficient childcare in place to meet the government's intention around expanding nursery relief. Now, we consider that that day nursery relief is correctly targeted and is benefiting those for whom it's intended. Now, coming on to the questions that have been asked, which you may want to hear before you ask your intervention.
Just ask about this specific anomaly, because what this proposal will do is to arrive at a situation where a nursery within an independent school, which is a charitable foundation, will have its business rates relief removed. But an independent profit-making nursery will still be eligible. Where is the logic in that, Minister?
So non-domestic rates are a rate that's levied on properties. When it comes to the nursery relief applies to properties that are wholly or mainly nurseries. To do otherwise would not be consistent with the principles of rating that rate whole properties, and there's a big risk of unintended behavioural responses. So nursery relief already applies to properties that are wholly or mainly nurseries. And if that was not the case, there is a number of potential for, well, there's a big potential for tax avoidance. You could create a very small nursery to get relief on a significant part of the school. So the point is that non-domestic rates are levied on properties and nursery relief apply to properties irrespective of whether they are private, public or third sector. They apply to properties that are wholly or mainly nurseries. There is a number of advantages and efficiencies for properties that are part of a larger property. You can share resources, you can share access. There is a number of advantages, which is why I think it's important that nursery life continues to apply to properties that are wholly or mainly nurseries. And that is a level playing field. That applies to public nurseries as well as private nurseries. Yep.
Thank the Minister for taking an intervention. She makes a distinction between properties that are wholly or mainly used for nurseries in the context of nursery relief, and I understand that point. But she seemed to imply that this was a general principle of rating, that across the board, rating applies to properties that are wholly or mainly. That's not my understanding. My understanding is that if you look at the valuation rule, there are plenty of properties, buildings that are apportioned between different ratepayers according to different uses. So I just wanted to clarify whether the point you're making is just about nursery relief, and I think you're correct in that. That's how the relief is framed, whether we agree with it or not, that's how it's framed, or whether you were seeking to make a wider point about rating in general.
I think I'm making two different points. One is about rating in general, which is a property relief. And I think it's important to identify it as a property relief. And that secondly, when it comes to this amendment does not distinguish, the bill does not distinguish between private, public or state. It is not creating an unfair disadvantage for the private sector, because at the moment the relief is in place for all properties that are wholly or mainly used for nurseries, and independent private nurseries have just as much to gain from that as nurseries in the state sector. In terms of, we consider that nursery relief is correctly targeted, but of course the key point is that all nurseries, whether private, public or third sector, are currently being treated equally. Yeah.
I just want to clarify whether you think there's a specific issue about day nurseries or not. You mentioned that in your opening comments on these amendments. I was wondering if you're making a distinction between day nurseries or nurseries where children are residential. Was that an intentional differential? And can you talk a little bit about tax evasion, or are you suggesting that schools would just reconfigure how they use their land?
Yeah, I wasn't intentionally making a distinction. I don't understand. I don't believe that there is a distinction. The point is that nursery relief is available to all standalone properties.
It's a standalone issue, that's your distinction.
Yeah, yes, but my consideration is mainly or wholly used for that purpose. Okay. Whereas if you are part of a larger property, it's clear that it's not mainly or wholly used for that intention. Yeah.
It's clear that the nursery relief, that is how it's framed. The question is, should that be how it's framed?
Well, indeed.
That's the essential point. And to hide behind the fact that that is how it is framed, that's not a general principle of rating. If a private enterprise were to, if a shop or a business were to open up in a larger property that otherwise qualified for charitable relief or whatever, the assessors would assess that independently. This is not a general principle of rating. The question is, that's how it's framed in the nursery relief. The question is whether it's how it should be framed.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. The point I'm trying to make is that this is being presented as a significant unfair disadvantage primarily for the independent sector. And my point is that this relief makes no distinction between private, public and state. In that sense, it does create a level playing field. The difference is that it's wholly or mainly. My understanding is that this relief is suggesting that only in the private school sector should nurseries be able to access the relief that are not mainly or wholly used as nurseries, without any thought to the fact that that suddenly means that non-standalone nurseries in the public sector will not be able to apply for this relief. So actually it creates unfairness where unfairness does not currently exist. In terms of additional support needs, so again, we recognise that there is good work undertaken in both the independent and the public sector schools to educate children with a range of differing needs. And placing a child with additional support needs in a mainstream school may not suit the child's ability or aptitude and may negatively impact on the learning of other children in the school. And so that means for a number of children, it's important that their needs are best met through attending an independent specialist school. And so independent specialist schools cater solely for children with specific or complex additional support needs as a result of severe behavioural problems, learning difficulties or physical or sensory disabilities. Now, members will know that the bill retains relief for those special schools. Amendments 76 and 77 would additionally retain relief for independent schools which provide any additional support without a requirement that it might be the whole or main purpose of the school. My hope would be that independent schools, all independent schools, are providing some form of additional support needs for children in their schools. And therefore, this amendment would undermine the Barclay Review's recommendation to address the fairness. So, as such, I could not support that amendment. In terms of amendments 80 to 83, that relates to the timing of commencement of Section 10. So the Section 30 of the bill sets out the government's position on commencement of what will become the Act's provision. And the Barclay Review implementation plan was published in December 2017, which is 2 years ago, and it was clear that we would deliver the change by 2020 to allow time for those schools affected to plan ahead, and that is a direct quote. The independent schools provisions are not currently identified for early commencement, but I can confirm that it would be the government's intention to commence these provisions from the 1st of September 2020, subject, of course, to the committee's decisions and votes. A September 2020 commencement date would be almost 3 years after the change was first recommended by the Barclay Review, and it would tie introduction to the academic year rather than the start of the financial year, which should hopefully help schools with their planning for academic year 2021. We've always been clear that we will deliver this change as recommended by the Barclay Review, and I hope that confirmation of the government's commencement intentions will assist the sector in its ongoing planning. Yes.
So just to be clear, Minister, 1st September 2020, from that date, the mandatory relief would be withdrawn, so rates would be payable from the 1st of September.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Which is, as I said, almost 3 years since we published the Barclay implementation plan, which stated that the change would come into effect in April 2020. So there is a number of months there in the hope that that gives schools the additional time to make their plans. In terms of speaking to some of the specific questions, some of which I may well have forgotten, I go back to the point I made at the outset in terms of the impact of this provision, notwithstanding that some members fundamentally disagree ideologically with the government's intentions. In terms of the impact, I still maintain that the impact, the financial impact, will be minimal. There are two different areas that committee members have picked up on. The first is the impact on the schools themselves, and the second is the impact on the state sector. In terms of the state sector, Scottish schools have an average spare working capacity of 30% in 2018. So when it comes to looking at the cost implications, we should be looking at the marginal cost. So in a majority of cases, the marginal cost of a pupil moving from the independent sector to the state sector will be zero. So even if 3% were to transfer, we do not accept the suggestion that it would leave the policy revenue neutral. And in terms,
So that figure you've just quoted, that's a Scotland-wide figure. Have you done analysis in places like Edinburgh and Perth and Kinross?
So in terms of places like Perth and Kinross in particular, a number of pupils are probably unlikely to live in the same local authority area as the local authority area that they currently go to school. So there is a number of pupils, for example, in independent schools in Perth and Kinross who do not necessarily live in Perth and Kinross. Therefore, the impact would probably be distributed on a Scotland-wide basis, or certainly the impact in the state sector would be in the area where they live, not in the area where they currently go to school, which is why I think the Scotland-wide figure is more important in terms of looking at the impact in the round.
Yep. It sounds like you've not actually done any analysis of this. You're just assuming certain things. You've not. Have you actually asked the sector about this?
Well,
where the pupils are from, where they live?
These figures are informed by COSLA. So these are COSLA's figures in terms of what they perceive the impact to be on their local authority area. And as you'll know, COSLA represents all local authorities, and these figures are informed by a Scotland-wide perspective on what the impact would be on local authorities. In terms of the magnitude of the change on the schools themselves, I don't dispute that in some particularly smaller schools there's going to be a more significant impact than in larger schools, as Andy Whiteman already said, which is why, again, we have looked at the average impact. And the impact of our proposals are equivalent to 1.3% of the current average fees, which is a small increase compared to the average yearly fee increase of 4%. Now, I accept that those are averages. I think it's important we use averages because we need to look at the general impact. And therefore, I find it difficult to accept that a magnitude of that change is sufficient to lead to a mass exodus of pupils. Aside from all of that, our intention is to accept the Barclay Review recommendation to remove the unfairness that exists between public schools and private schools. I will continue to accept, that not all members share the government's intention. That might be so. This is the current progress that we're making in this area, and that is the reason why I don't accept these amendments.
Okay, thank you very much. Liz Smith, to wind up, please.
Thank you, and can I thank both the convener and the Minister and members for their contributions. Can I begin with some general comments? I fully accept for what the Minister said and what she replied to my intervention. This is not about trying to close down the independent sector. I understand that. The independent sector has a very proud record of very considerable educational advantage in terms of the results that it delivers, not just to people who are able to afford the fees, and also in terms of the public benefit that they provide to their local communities. And if I can take you back to the legislation of 2005, when this Parliament actually debated whether there should be charitable status for the independent sector, at that time there was actually a very considerable financial discussion about what the public benefit was, and all parties, some of them who had dissented in the first instance, agreed that there shouldn't be an attack on that sector. The problem that we have with these proposals is that perhaps by unintended consequences, that is exactly what is going to happen, because we do know that there are some of the smaller schools, some of the very small schools, who are really struggling just now. And it's not just because of pension changes, it is because of these potential proposals which would... Of course.
Does the member accept, though, these changes have not actually been implemented yet? So if schools are, as she says, are considering their business models, for want of a better phrase, just now, then there's clearly bigger challenges facing the independent state sector than these marginal changes.
But, Minister, the independent sector through SCIS has provided you with very substantial arithmetical calculations of what the implications of this could be. And that's come through some regional applications as well, whether it's Perth and Kinross or Edinburgh, Glasgow, whoever it might be. There has been a very substantial analysis undertaken by these schools about what the implications will be. And I'm sorry to say, I do not believe that the Scottish Government has undertaken the same comprehensive analysis, and that was proven in the Stage 1 debate, where the financial memorandum on this is weak. Nobody is arguing that there should be a circumstance whereby the independent sector has the special privileges when it comes to their own finances. That would be completely wrong. But what they are asking for is that if there's to be evidence provided for making legislative changes, then that should be convincing on the facts. And these facts, Minister, have not yet been provided. Now, I don't believe, and to take up a point that Annabel Ewing rightly raised, there's not going to be a mass exodus, but there will be some pupils whose parents can no longer afford to have education in the independent sector. And from a small school perspective, that can make the difference between being able to continue or not. And you mentioned the fact that it's been 3 years to think about this. There actually hasn't been 3 years to think about it with the facts to hand about the implications of what the Scottish Government's proposals would actually mean for the sector. So I think that's something, and that's another reason why I think some... Of course.
Technical point. It's just really, it occurs to me that, you know, if I was the board of a particular mainstream independent school, I would certainly by this point, and I think it would have been a dereliction of duty not to have started to investigate what it would look like under the relief being removed, what the situation would look like, because they would have to make plans about future fee increases and all the rest of it. So I would find it very hard to believe, as a matter of practicality, that the schools have not already started to look at this issue in detail themselves.
All the independent schools, their boards, their heads, their bursars have all been looking at this for a very long period of time. The problem is that the facts that they need to be able to base their analysis on from the Scottish Government, they're not there, or they're not there in complete things.
So just one brief intervention just on that point, but what facts? Because the facts are, well, if you're going to lose relief and pay your rates, you look at then the rating law applicable to buildings of similar size, etc. And, you know, that's quite self-evident. So I don't quite see what possible lack of facts you could be referring to in that regard to try to ascertain what the rates will look like, broad brush, come the entry into force, hopefully, of this bill?
Because there are implications for the sector, whether that's in terms of the public benefit that they are continue to be able to provide or not least because of what Martin Tyson said in his statement to committee, that there are circumstances which as yet are not clear for the independent sector. That's the problem that they have. And I think Andy Whiteman, in his very good comments about the nursery provision, he's absolutely right. And my amendment, I think, does make the difference, Minister, between what is wholly or partially available. I think Mr Whiteman is quite correct that there are other issues being raised about this, not just about the level playing field, which I think is so important to deliver it. So I think Andy Whiteman has made a very strong point on that. Just to finish my own comments, I think that the Minister's keen to promote what COSLA is saying, and I think that's only one part of the story. There's another. Yep.
I'm not keen to promote what anybody's saying. I'm merely answering the question about where the figures came from in terms of informing it. This is not a case of plucking figures from the sky. This is a case of COSLA identifying what the potential impact would be on the state sector. And they, of course, deliver education.
Yeah, but my point is that that's one issue. There is the other issue of what the real impact will be in terms of public benefit. And I think these independent schools will want to continue to provide that public benefit. I think they will want to continue to provide the bursary support that they have considerably increased since the legislation in 2005, rightly so in my opinion, and we shouldn't forget that some of the independent schools failed that charity test, rightly so, and therefore had to up their game. And I think it's a great pity that all that good work that has been done to ensure that these schools are more accessible is going to be undermined by this, because there will be some youngsters whose parents, and it'll in many cases be youngsters who would otherwise not be able to attend the independent sector unless they had a bursary. That is undermining that principle. And I don't understand, in terms of the Scottish Government's very strong record in promoting equity and excellence in schools, I don't understand how this legislation meets that criteria, because there is no doubt in my mind that this makes the sector more elitist. That's exactly what we don't want. That's exactly what the independent sector has been fighting for a very long time. So, you know, I don't get where we're coming from in this at all. I think it's a regressive step, and as I say, I think it undermines all the good work that the Parliament had done unanimously in 2005. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are you going to press or withdraw Amendment 73?
I'm going to press Amendment 73.
You may. Thank you very much. The question therefore is that Amendment 73 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Those in favour of Amendment 73? Those opposed to Amendment 73? 73A, that was 4-2. Opposed to Amendment 73. I call Amendment 15 in the name of Andy Whiteman and a group on its own. Andy Whiteman to move and speak to Amendment 15.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. So, as we've just been discussing, of course, Section 10 of the bill provides for the withdrawal of charitable relief from independent schools. There was some debate, obviously, at an early stage in response to the Barclay recommendation on that in relationship to some schools in the independent sector, specifically specialist schools. And the bill reflects that conversation and the decision by the government to exempt them from the withdrawal, in other words, to retain the status quo for them. And one of those was for schools that provide education for pupils who are selected on the basis of music ability or potential. My amendment simply seeks to apply the principle that the ministers outlined on a number of occasions earlier today. Again, she said the current difference between the independent and the public sector should end. So on the basis that there is, I think, only one school in the independent sector that provides education for pupils who are selected on the basis of music ability, but there are 4 public schools in that sector, or in reality parts of public schools, which would have to be valued separately if my amendment passes. But they provide exactly the same services, and the Minister's well aware of them. They're the National Centres of Excellence in Music at Douglas Academy in East Dunbartonshire, the City of Edinburgh Music School at Broughton High School in Edinburgh, the Aberdeen City Music School at Dyce Academy in Aberdeen, and the National Centre of Excellence in Traditional Music at Plockton, which the Minister will be, no doubt, very familiar with. So my amendment merely seeks to extend the status quo in relationship to relief from rates as such, not relief from charitable relief, because of course public schools don't receive charitable relief, but extend the relief from rates to independent, to specialist music schools that are in the public sector. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Graham?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. This seems like a very fair amendment. The committee was quite critical, actually, of the section of the bill that would only give specialist music schools rates relief. And I recall the discussion was, well, why not schools that specialise in other areas? Why not schools that specialise in science or sport? Why leave it at just music? But we are where we are. It's in the bill. So it seems to me that if this is to survive in the bill, what Andy Whiteman is suggesting is entirely fair. That if you were to have this relief applying in the independent sector, why not also in the public or state sector?
Would the member take a brief intervention?
I've just finished, actually.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah, no, feel free. Just
No, it's okay. I'll come.
carry on. No,
Oh,
please.
we're like,
Say that, and then Annabelle can come in and make the point she was.
Probably intervening me. I'd quite like to explore the issues in Andy Whiteman's amendment in relation to the treatment of state schools which specialise in music as centres of excellence in terms of the same treatment that St Mary's Music School gets. And I think access to music in our schools is something that, due to SNP cuts, has been increasingly under threat. And I think all of our schools should be providing music tuition and access to teaching, which would support students who want to excel in music, or even to access music tuition and not have to pay for it. And I think it's a really important building block in terms of personal development, expression, confidence, health, and valuable life skills. So I get the fact that local authorities are facing cuts from their budget, and the instrumental music tuition is particularly feeling the pinch. If you look at the last academic year, there was a sharp increase in fees for instrumental music tuition compared with previous years, with 38% of local authorities increasing tuition fees. And that's meant a decline in students studying music across our state schools. So I think that's part of the context, but it really takes you to the point of, why does this bill ignore the 4 state schools which are centres of excellence, which have not just prioritised music teaching, which you would hope for, but have heavily invested in it? And the 4 schools Andy Whiteman mentioned don't get the benefit of that in the way that St Mary's Music School does, which is not to argue against St Mary's Music School, because as I understand it, 70% of its funding comes directly from the Scottish Government. I think the issue is more about fairness in terms of how the Scottish Government deals with music specialisms in those schools. So surely those other schools are worthy of support to acknowledge the substantial additional investment required to provide that music and teaching infrastructure, which is not about arguing against other state schools putting that investment in, because, as I say, I think all of them should do it. And given that all of our state schools pay non-domestic rates, the point that was made earlier, not all that income goes back to schools because of huge pressures. So hopefully, if this bill goes through, there will be extra resources going to local authorities which will enable music prioritisation, but it doesn't address the issue at the heart of Andy's amendment, which is about equal treatment between the state and the private sector, which I think his amendment potentially introduces. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Annabelle.
Yes, just briefly, I note again from our Committee Stage 1 report, and I quote it, paragraph 117, page 36, we are not persuaded that the case for treating independent specialist music schools, in practice one school at present, any differently from any other independent schools has been clearly made. We went on to say, there are a number of independent and state schools that could be said to make a distinctive contribution to musical culture or in other areas, such as Scotland's National Centres for Excellence. So just looking at this amendment number 15, instead of getting a clearer position, we seem to be muddying the waters even further. So on that basis alone, I would not be able to support it. But I just wonder, given that that is the amendment that has been put forward, but as a matter of principle, I don't see that this really helps us in any particular degree in terms of consistency. I just wonder what the respective cost of the status quo of the bill versus the cost implications of this amendment of Mr Whiteman would be, just as a matter of interest. I don't know if Mr Whiteman knows what the cost of his amendment might be. I don't know. I'm looking at Mr Whiteman. He's not paying me any attention, so I don't know if that means that he doesn't know, or maybe he does. Maybe the Minister knows. Maybe somebody knows what the cost implications of this amendment might be. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. I do believe that this amendment does have some merit in where we are and how we progress that. It has the opportunity to equalise, to give the same opportunity for the state schools that have that expertise. And as already has been mentioned, councils are suffering from that. Even in Clackmannanshire, with my own region, we've seen 60% reduction in music tuition within some of that sector because of the fees that have been introduced, and because of that, that is disadvantaging masses of individuals in that community who in the past had the opportunity to unlock that potential. So I think that in this case, this should be given some more opportunity for discussion and to see if it can be, because I do believe that at the end of the day, it will equalise the sector and support these schools.
Okay, thank you. Liz, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just a short point, if I may. I do think that this amendment is important because I think what Mr Whiteman has done is to identify that there are many different types of schools in Scotland, both within the state sector and the independent sector. And I think perhaps that reflects, how shall I describe it, exceptional circumstances rather than just the legal term special schools that we've become used to. I think Mr Whiteman's amendment reflects that difference. Perhaps we need to do some refinement before stage 3, but I think it does deal with the anomaly which would occur if we allowed for differences within the independent sector, if we weren't recognising that the state sector, quite rightly, has considerable differences. And again, I come back to the point I raised with the Minister earlier, that both sectors should be all about choice and excellence, and there is no doubt that the schools that Mr Whiteman is referring to are excellent schools, and so I do think it's an important amendment.
Can I just say that at stage 1, as Annabelle Ewing has just said, we made it quite clear that we didn't, the committee made it quite clear that we didn't support this proposal, which was going to just affect one school. It now seems that the amendment, and it's got every right to put it forward, but if the committee then agrees on this amendment, what we're saying is that we didn't agree with it at stage 1. We now agree with it at stage school, as long as we add the 4 public schools, but we still don't use the other schools of excellence, which means that music is getting a more important place in the curriculum and in terms of relief than any other one. And for me, that would make our stage 1 report look a bit strange. Minister, it's for you.
Well, Convener, I do recognise that the committee was not persuaded by the case for treating independent specialist music schools differently, although I do think that this amendment helps to highlight what a unique school St Mary's Music School is, and perhaps Village School, through a number of comments on the amendment, which I do think is well intentioned. The amendment, which seeks to broaden eligibility to include public schools, which are wholly or mainly used for the purpose of musical excellence, rightly recognises that schools have much to be proud of in terms of promoting excellence across various subjects, including sport, art and musical excellence. And I think last time Kenny Gibson called for a special school on football, having seen Scotland lose the night before. So whilst there are schools that offer specialised provision, they nearly always do so as part of a mainstream curriculum, and they rightly offer the benefits to other pupils attending the school. So, for example, few of the pupils attending some of the schools that have been identified, including Plockton or Douglas Academy, do so solely because of their musical aptitude, although, of course, some do. Conversely, every pupil attending St Mary's does so purely on the basis of their musical ability, and as such it offers a unique national service, which is why it merits a unique policy solution. Now, according to the amendment, I don't think that any schools would currently meet the criteria that are set out in the amendment. So schools such as Plockton and Brockton High School don't select pupils on the basis of musical ability alone, and nor are they, one of those favourite phrases from this morning, wholly or mainly used for the purpose of developing musical excellence. And lastly, of course, the impact, as Sarah Boyack, I think, was identifying, the impact would be on the local authorities, not on the schools themselves. So the local authorities would then decide whether or not... Yep.
I'm grateful for that. You were just making the point about it's important to have one school of excellence. If you look at the income backgrounds of students attending St Mary's, the number from the lowest income backgrounds is declining. So surely there's a real issue about access and fairness here. And the fact that you've got 4 schools which do specialise in the state sector in different parts of the country, albeit one of them is Broughton, isn't that exposing an issue here that's a challenge about students from low income backgrounds not getting access to music in state schools and not getting access to St Mary's? And we've got 4 schools that are more accessible for students in different bits of the country, and yet they're not getting the same tax treatment as you're proposing in this bill for St Mary's.
I think it's a fair point, and that's why I think in terms of the intention of the amendment, I think is laudable. I think it doesn't actually achieve that because none of those schools are, unlike St Mary's, used wholly or mainly for the purpose of musical tuition, and students are not selected on the basis of aptitude. Now, there may be a very strong argument for us to look at what more we can do to ensure that St Mary's is more accessible and also to support musical tuition across the state sector. But the point here is that the local authorities in which each of those schools is situated would get a tax benefit. It would then be up to them whether or not that's passed on. We can't dictate or mandate, but local authorities would choose. And of course, just assuming for a moment that it would only be those 4 schools, it would only be those local authorities, of course, that would get the financial benefit, not every local authority that is providing musical tuition. In terms of the financial impact, my understanding is that the cost of this relief to St Mary's would be approximately £30,000. If the 4 schools that have been identified were eligible, which there are big question marks around, that would cost approximately £900,000 per annum. So £900,000 going to those 4 local authority areas, and £30,000 is the cost of St Mary's. So it's quite a significant leap in cost.
Right, thank you. Andy Whiteman, to wind up.
Thanks very much, Convener. So thanks, members, for various points. I'll try and deal with them all. firstly, in terms of the convener referencing our Stage 1 report, of course, there is a case for extending this to other schools and national centres of excellence, and the convener's perfectly entitled to bring forward amendments to that effect as well. I'm merely focusing on the one particular aspect that's referred to in the bill, which is specialist music schools. And I mean, on that, I just want to turn to the Minister's comments. I don't know what the selection criteria are at Plockton, but I do know that the City of Edinburgh Music School selects pupils on the basis of musical ability or potential. It does that. I mean, there's, I don't know, 50, 60 pupils there. It's not just Broughton High School, it's the primary school at Flora Stevens as well, Stevenson School, primary school, which is part of the City of Edinburgh Music School. In terms of wholly or mainly, we're talking about lands and heritages which are occupied by public school, which selects pupils on this basis and are wholly or mainly used for the purpose of developing musical excellence. That exists. These schools have designated areas. They are premises. Now, to answer Annabel Ewing's question about the cost, and I'm intrigued at the Minister's claim on the costs, we couldn't identify the costs until we'd undertake an evaluation, because at the moment, these 4 schools are valued as one. So, for example, Broughton High School has got a valuation, a rateable value of £803,000 as of April 17. So the Lothian assessor is going to have to go there and reassess, were this amendment to pass, going to have to reassess the school and apportion that bit which provides the specialist music school. Yep.
So the costs I identified were if the whole school were to be exempt in terms of the relief. So that's where the costing comes from. The second point is I accept that some pupils are selected on the basis of that. The amendment specifically references in point 2, it's 2A2, that it follows a curriculum which includes classes aimed at developing musical excellence and are wholly or mainly used for that purpose, for developing musical excellence. So the point I was making is that there may be some pupils that are selected, there may be classes which are focused primarily on musical excellence, but I would find it difficult to believe that all 4 schools are used wholly or mainly for that musical purpose, in light of the fact that they are also local authority schools that have a catchment area.
Well, that's the case. They're not wholly or mainly used for the purpose, but that portion, that apportionment of the lands and heritages which are wholly or mainly. And this gets us back to the argument about the nursery schools. And I just had a look at the practice note actually from the Scottish Assessor on day nurseries, and it particularly makes reference to the fact that, I don't have it right, well actually I do have it here. It says day nurseries adjacent to or within the grounds of school properties or forming part of the school property and providing the preschool education for the associated school may be valued in terms of Scottish Assessors Association Public Buildings Committee Practice Note number 5. This is routine. Yep.
But point remains that there is no apportionment in your amendment. There's no apportionment at the moment in the amendment. And secondly, when it comes to schools, it's a lot easier, for example, to apportion B&Bs between residential and non-residential. You're implying that we can apportion centres of excellence relative to the rest of the school, but that's very difficult to conceive when a lot of the areas are common between that centre and the rest of the school.
This bill makes no provision on the process of valuation, because that's a process undertaken by professional valuers independently. Valuers are well used to apportioning values in complex properties. And typically, for example, in common areas, they'll apportion that in proportion to the amount of use that particular use takes of the whole building. This is not difficult for valuers, and it would be inappropriate for me to make any reference to how to be valued, because that is left entirely up to independent assessors. Now, if there's some drafting issues here about wholly or mainly, I'm happy to deal with them. But this amendment is predicated on the notion that we have a well-established valuation process that is already apportions parts of buildings that are used for different purposes. For example, a cafe, a shop, or whatever. Sarah Boyer talked about the more general question of musical education, and I accept all her points entirely. I mean, obviously, this is a non-domestic rates bill. It's about the liability of properties for rates, and insofar as music is being referred to here, we're talking about properties that are exclusively used for specialist music schools, whether they're public schools or private schools. And just to repeat, I mean, we could have further amendments at stage 3 here. I'm just seeking to apply some consistency in relationship to the principle that's been established at the beginning of this, that there should be parity between the independent and the public, independent schools and public schools. The logic of that is that there should be a level playing field. That was followed thereafter by a proposal by the government that's incorporated in the bill that they should create certain exemptions. And my amendment follows on from that, or one part of that, which those exemptions themselves should be a level playing field. I don't think I have anything more to say. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Pressing, Andy? You're pressing?
Yes, yes. I don't think I even moved it, but I moved it and pressed it here.
Right. We'll just rewind and start again then. Okay, thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 15? Those opposed? The amendment is passed 4-2. I call Amendment 74 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated, with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 74 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 74? Those opposed? And as convener, I have a casting vote, and giving that the member who is missing is likely to have voted along the same way, I will be voting against the amendment. Call Amendment 75 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Yes, moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 75 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 75? 3. Those opposed? 3. And once again, I will use my casting vote to oppose the amendment. That's call Amendment 76 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 76 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 76? 2. Those opposed? 3, 4. 4. Amendment 76 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 77 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 78 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 78 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 78? 3. Those opposed? 3. And I will use my casting vote to vote against Amendment 78. I call Amendment 79 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 79 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 79? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 79 is not agreed to. Okay. Yeah. Right. I therefore... Yeah. We'll have a short break just now. Right. I call Amendment 93 in the name of Sarah Boyack and a group on its own. Sarah Boyack to move and speak to Amendment 93.
Thank you, Convener. I submitted Amendment 93 because I wanted to raise the issue of why councils pursue ALIOs. It was suggested in the Barclay Review that it was a tax avoidance issue. But I do think it's worth pointing out the pressure local authorities are currently under is immense, and there are many benefits that comes from arm's length sports and culture organisations which local authorities have set up specifically to enable communities access to facilities that they wouldn't otherwise be able to avoid. I do want to say that I'm not an enthusiast for outsourcing, and we'd far prefer councils to be able to run their own in-house services. But we shouldn't underestimate the fact that ALIOs are not providing core services such as education or social care, so aren't ring-fenced in terms of investment, but they still have huge importance in terms of health and well-being benefits, particularly in the sports and culture area. So I wanted to flag that amendment just to, I reacted against the term in the Barclay Review about tax avoidance because I think it's from legitimate pressures and it's from the best intentions that our public sector local authorities are trying to provide valuable, affordable services to our constituents, and it's about the funding deal that they get from the Scottish Government. So that's really why I put the amendment forward, and I'm interested in colleagues' comments. Convener, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any comment to make? Yeah, Andy?
Sorry, yes, just a short comment. I broadly agree with the intention of this amendment. However, I suppose, and maybe the Minister will make some comments to this regard, it talks about any reduction or remission of rates should not be offset by reduction in annual central government grants to that authority, which gets us into the field of local government finance. So I'm just wondering about the kind of competence of this amendment in that sense. And given that the existing funding formula for local government takes account of non-domestic rate revenue, I don't think it's obvious that were this amendment to pass, that there would be an automatic impact on local government settlement. I think it's a difficult amendment to try and do, to introduce a financial mechanism in relationship to the annual settlement into a non-domestic rate bill, but I'd be keen to hear what the Minister has to say.
Okay, Minister.
Convener, I think there is a widespread acknowledgement that ALIOs are often established for financial reasons to avoid non-domestic rates, and I would agree with the Stage 1 report from this committee which noted, and I quote, tax avoidance corrodes public confidence in the tax system. The amendment here would facilitate that further, I think, by removing the financial disincentive for councils considering adopting or expanding ALIOs. And perhaps it would be helpful if I were to set out the Scottish Government's position, because we partly rejected the Barclay Review recommendation that ALIOs should lose eligibility for charity relief in order to protect the public services that were already being delivered through that route across the country. And as such, existing ALIOs will continue to receive the levels of charity relief support they received at the time of the announcement, adjusted for inflation and the impact of future revaluations. So no existing ALIOs will be worse off as a result of the decision. But in the spirit of my initial comments around tax avoidance, and in order to prevent further proliferation of ALIOs, where a new ALIO is established or an existing ALIO is expanded, we will claw back any increased cost of relief. So councils can still create or expand existing ALIOs where it makes policy sense to do so, but the Scottish Government would not facilitate tax avoidance by allowing them to retain their financial benefits. And I hope that explanation is helpful. I don't think it answers Andy Whiteman's question. I don't know if he wants to repeat it though. No, okay. In which case, I would, I hope that Ms Boyack will consider carefully whether to press her amendment, and I would encourage the committee not to accept the amendment for those reasons.
Okay, thank you. Sarah?
I'm not going to press it at this stage, but I remain convinced that ALIOs have not just been established for tax avoidance purposes. I know several local authorities who've established them for very good principles, so I'm not going to push it at this stage. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sarah Boyack wishes to withdraw her amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? No. In that case, then the amendment is withdrawn. Thank you. I call Amendment 94 in the name of Sarah Boyack, grouped with Amendments 95, 40 and 41. Sarah Boyack to move Amendment 94 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. Well, I wanted to introduce this amendment because I felt that it was important that guidance is laid before the Scottish Parliament and that we get sufficient time for proper scrutiny, because these are important issues. It's been commented before that we very rarely have discussions on non-domestic rates legislation, and this is a generational opportunity. So I wanted to make sure that following on from this legislation, we get proper updates. I've read the alternative proposals by the Scottish Government, and to me they don't make the same commitment. They don't go as far as my amendments do. So for the purpose of accountability and transparency, I think these are important amendments, and I hope colleagues will support them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Minister, you speak to Amendment 40 and the other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. Perhaps if I could start with Sarah Boyack's amendment, because we carefully considered what the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee Stage 1 report had to say on these Section 11 powers, which enable the Scottish Government to issue guidance to rating authorities about their discretion to grant sports club relief. And in terms of our own response to that, we consider that it's really important that those who need to have regard to the guidance and those who may currently be in receipt of this discretionary relief should be involved in the drafting of the guidance. And the guidance will mostly be about dissemination of good local authority practice than about central government seeking to direct what local authorities do. So to that end, a working group has been set up to progress the drafting of that guidance, and work will get underway very shortly. The working group comprises representatives from the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation, Sports Scotland, Scottish Sports Association, local authority revenue staff, Community Leisure Scotland and Vocal, the voice of Chief Officers in Culture and Leisure in Scotland. But I am be very happy to commit today, if the committee would find it helpful, to undertake to seek the committee's comments on the draft guidance produced by that working group. So that's in response to 94 and 95. Yeah.
So I understand all that. I mean, it's on a broader point. I mean, Section 4 of the 1962 Act is about reduction and remission of rates payable by charitable and other organisations. And I think one of the concerns that certainly I and I think other members of the committee have had through the Barclay process is that, as I say, it was very narrowly focused. The charitable relief then came up as an issue that was going to be applied to one particular type of property that enjoyed charitable relief, that's to say independent schools. But we heard evidence when we visited Kilmarnock, I think it was, that a profitable business in the high street had closed down, a furniture shop, because of a charitable shop that was on the high street that was selling furniture, but that didn't pay its staff because they were all volunteers. And this, I mean, that really highlights the fact that the Independent Schools Amendment is we've dealt with that obviously, but it just deals with one bit of the charitable sector. And my question is there not a case for a wider review of how charitable relief is in fact applied when we have anecdotal evidence anyway that it's having a serious impact on the viability of businesses?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's a very fair comment, and I wouldn't dispute the need perhaps to have a broader look at how charity relief is applied across the board. In a sense, I know it's different, but in a sense, it's something similar to this small business bonus scheme, i.e. to identify whether it's actually achieving its purposes and whether or not it's undermining the rest of the local economy. I think that's separate to these amendments, but I wouldn't dispute the points that are raised. I think these amendments highlight essentially whether or not the government or the Parliament through these amendments should determine the guidance, or whether it should be informed by those stakeholders that I've identified. But I'll leave it with the committee to tell me whether or not they would be keen for an opportunity to comment on the draft guidance. If I could speak to my own amendments briefly, 40 and 41, they require that as soon as is reasonably practical after producing guidance to local authorities, the Scottish ministers will lay a copy of that guidance before Parliament and publish it. That ensures that the committee can then consider what the guidance says if it sees a need. So for those reasons, I do not see that the need would arise for Parliament to annul the guidance, as it will have the opportunity to comment, and I therefore don't support amendments 94 and 95 but hope that committee members will support my amendments 40 and 41.
Thank you very much. Annabelle?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Yes, I think it's a very helpful suggestion on the part that the Minister has made to seek to involve the committee in that way in terms of providing comments on any draft guidance, and I do welcome that. Just on the picking up the point that Mr Whiteman made about the a wider look, a review, I think he called for, on charitable relief in general. I just wonder, given what happened last week, where in effect Mr Whiteman's amendment has locked in the position that the national relief of, for example, the small business bonus, which the Minister said is currently subject to review, and we don't know the outcome of that, but nonetheless his amendment, supported by others in this committee, but not by myself and my colleagues in the SNP, that this amendment that he had moved last week would in effect lock in a position notwithstanding there's reviews. I find that a bit contradictory, I have to say. On the one hand, he wants review about something, and on the other hand, he locks in a position notwithstanding that there is a review to take away the national relief of the small business bonus.
Back to the issue in front
Quite
of us,
inconsistent, I would have thought.
Right, okay. Sorry about that. Anybody else wish to comment? No. All right. In that case, Sarah, it's for you to wind up and press or withdraw, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Oh, I am still minded to push my amendments. I think we do need more parliamentary scrutiny, notwithstanding the helpful comments that the Minister has made about the working group. I think that's important. I do think there's an issue here about when we're passing complicated legislation, there is something about the amount of time everybody has to deal with it, and there's something about making sure that all those that pay that that taxation and those that are impacted on it, we need that wider discussion, and I think we need that accountability. So I welcome the fact in fact, we've got choices here and we've got strengths of amendments, and I would prefer mine 94 and 95 to the Minister's, and I'll leave it at that point.
Okay.
And I don't think I've technically moved Amendment 94. Would you like me to do that at this point?
You just have.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 94 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Those in favour of 94? That's 4. Those opposed? 2. 94 is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 95 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 94. The Sarah Boyack to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 95 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Yes. Those in favour of Amendment 95? 4. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 95 is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 40 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 94. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. Question is that Amendment 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Those in favour of Amendment 40? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 40 is not agreed to. And I call Amendment 41 in the name of the Minister, already debated
Moved.
with Amendment 94. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 41 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. No. Those in favour of Amendment 41? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 41 is not agreed to. The question is that Section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. I call Amendment 42 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 43.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government committed to devolving empty property relief in time for the next revaluation at the Scottish Budget this year. And Amendment 42 delivers that by repealing existing legislation that provides that no rates shall be payable on unoccupied lands and heritages. It also repeals a power that allows ministers to prescribe by regulation classes of unoccupied lands and heritage for which such rates are payable. While the amendment itself is simple, the implications are significant both for national non-domestic rates policy and for local empowerment. When the relief is appealed, local authorities will benefit from the cost of empty property relief to the Scottish Government, as they will see an equivalent increase in their revenue funding. And the nature of this transfer will be discussed with COSLA nearer the 2022 revaluation, as it's intended that this repeal will have effect from 1st of April 2022. Councils will have full flexibility over how they deploy those extra resources locally. Should they wish to replicate the former national relief or introduce any local reliefs, they have the option to do so using the powers given to them by the Community Empowerment Scotland Act. And should they wish to use their resources to support other local priorities, then that's a matter for them as individual councils that are accountable to their local electorate. This reform, along with others agreed at the budget this year, represents the biggest empowerment of local authorities since devolution. Well, perhaps that was more accurate last week, but it certainly was the biggest empowerment of local authorities since devolution, and I hope that the committee can support this amendment. Amendment 43 is a technical amendment to Section 12 of the bill to accommodate the changes made by Amendment 42. So I move Amendment 42.
Thank you very much. Any members wish to contribute? Sarah?
Thank you, Convener. I want to say I support the principle of this proposal because I think it's important that rates should be paid on unoccupied land. The proposal sits alongside the possibility that local authorities can still grant reliefs using their powers under the Community Empowerment Act. I note that COS has welcomed these powers in line with our aspirations for increased local fiscal empowerment. The only thing I would say to the Minister is I think there's a raft of powers that local authorities need to be able to tackle the issue of unoccupied and underutilised land if we're going to see land being used for the benefit of all of our communities and to enable wider economic success. And I think one of the financial challenges that councils currently face is the challenge of investing in regeneration and using their CPO powers and how they prioritise that amongst other challenges. So I think the importance of having compulsory sale order powers needs to be part of that range, and it needs to be an option to sit alongside this amendment and the other powers in the Community Empowerment Act. So it'd be good to get an update from the Minister when she sees that being in place, because I think these would complement each other. Thank you.
Okay, Andy.
Yes, thanks, Convener. In relationship to Amendments 42 and 43, I just want to place on record my thanks to the Minister for bringing these forward. These formed a commitment made in budget negotiations in January this year between the Scottish Greens and the Scottish Government to bring forward the devolution of non-domestic property, empty property relief to local authorities. So I welcome this amendment. We'll be supporting it.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister?
I noted Sarah Poyck's points. I'll come back to her, perhaps. It would be the easiest. And in the meantime, I move these
Thank
amendments.
you very much. The question is that Amendment 42 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Agreed. Call Amendment 43 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 42. Minister?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 43 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The question is that Section 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Section 12 is therefore agreed to. I call Amendment 44 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 45, 46, 47, 48 and 49. Minister to move Amendment 44 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. This Section 13 makes changes to the way in which local authorities can recover unpaid non-domestic rates, and it aims to bring the enforcement position for non-domestic rates broadly into line with the enforcement position that currently exists under council tax. The group of minor amendments before the committee today flow from discussions with local authority colleagues following the bill's introduction, and they fine-tune Section 13 of the bill rather than make substantive changes. And if I speak to each of the amendments in turn, Amendment 44 removes the reference to a demand note which may not cover a whole year and which is not essential to the operation of Section 8A1. Instead, what matters is that the ratepayer has a liability to the local authority and has failed to pay an instalment of that liability. Amendment 45 recognises that a ratepayer may be liable for the rates for part of the year only because they occupy the property only for part of a year. Amendments 47 and 48 amend subsections 4 and 5 respectively within new section 8A to make it clear that following a default, the ratepayer becomes liable for payment in full of the rates for which they are liable, and that this may be less than the full rates for the year. Amendment 46 is a consequential amendment flowing from Amendments 44 and 49 is a consequential amendment flowing from Amendments 47 and 48. We're keen to ensure that as far as is practical that the legislation enables local authorities to administer the non-domestic rates system in a flexible, efficient and effective manner, and those amendments deliver on that.
Thank you. Anybody? In that case, Minister, would you like to move the amendments?
I move these amendments.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 44 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Question 44 is agreed to. I call amendments 45, 46, 47, 48 and 49, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, and I invite the Ministers to move amendments 45 to 49 on block.
Moved on block.
Thank you. Does any member object? No. Thank you. The question is that amendments 45 to 49 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Agreed. The question is that section 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. I call amendment 50 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendment 51. Minister to move amendment 50 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. So amendments 50 and 51 reflect the aspirations of this committee and also my responsibilities as Minister for Digital and also discussions through stage 1 evidence sessions to improve the use of digital and electronic systems in the administration of the rate system. The Barclay Implementation Appeals Subgroup also supported in their final report the move to a paperless interaction between the assessor and the proprietor, tenant and occupier, and those amendments ensure that ministers are able by regulations to specify the way in which all notices in the context of non-domestic rates are communicated between parties. Amendment 50 provides powers for ministers to make regulations to allow or to require assessors, local authority ratepayers and any other statutorily involved party to issue notices by electronic means, and those notifications are currently provided in postal form, and I hope the committee would agree that it's important that we move forward. Amendment 51 specifies those regulations are subject to the affirmative procedure and that ministers must consult on them. So as well as providing the foundations to modernise the administration of the current system, including to support a more effective and efficient appeal system, those amendments will facilitate greater amounts of information to be shared than is currently the case. For example, in section 6 of the bill, it allows ministers to specify by regulations what information assessors must provide in the valuation notice. This may in future include the information that is currently publicly available on the assessor's portal for around 60% of properties in summary valuations. So the subgroup on appeals called for the provision of this type of information to be subject to a statutory requirement. The private representatives of that group also called for assessors to publish information subject to GDPR, of course, and commercial sensitivities relating to the comparable properties that were drawn upon to calculate a property's rateable value. That could amount to a significant amount of information which cannot reasonably be sent in postal form. In the context, of course, of the climate emergency, I'm keen to work with assessors and ratepayers to see how we can modernise the whole system in advance of the 2022 revaluation, particularly if you look at the figures at the moment, because as things currently stand, assessors are required to send around 800,000 letters at each revaluation, 400,000 at draft valuation stage and 400,000 at revaluation. So I hope that committee would agree that a move to a paperless system is in the best interest of all concerned, but that there needs to be the right opportunity to consult as well.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Any members? No? Okay. Minister, would you like to move the amendment?
I move the amendment.
The question is that Amendment 50 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. That's agreed. Call Amendment 51 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 50. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 51 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. Amendment 51 is agreed to. I call Amendment 4 in the name of Andy Whiteman and a group on its own. Andy Whiteman to move and speak to Amendment 4.
Thanks very much indeed, Convener. As members will be aware, we passed Amendment 9 last week, which inadvertently removed Section 153 of the Local Government Etc. Scotland Act 1994, which was not my intention. Just put on the record that we will be revisiting that at stage 3. The Amendment 4 provides that the secondary legislation enacted under the powers of Section 158 should be subject to the affirmative procedure, and committee members will probably remember with great fondness our meeting of the 20th of March this year, when we considered, I think, 9 or 10 instruments in relationship to non-domestic rates, 8 SSIs, which were passed under the powers of Section 153, of the Local Government Act, not 158, 153. And these SSIs, in one case, for example, the Small Business Bonus Scheme deals with reliefs to a tune of 250, 270 million pounds or so. And it's my view that when government is spending that amount of money, which is what government is doing, it is actually spending that money, it's giving it to local authorities, that should be subject to an affirmative procedure. The other instrument we passed in March, on the 20th of March, was the annual rates order, setting the rate for the second highest yielding tax in Scotland, just under 3 billion. And again, that was passed by negative instrument. 2 years ago, I had to move a motion to annul in order to bring the Cabinet Secretary here to have a debate about the tax rate of Scotland's second largest yielding tax. And it seems to me inconsistent that on the one hand we have an income tax resolution that's debated fully in Parliament, subject to full vote and subject to a great deal of scrutiny as part of the budget process. But to raise just under £3 billion of public finance is done via the negative procedure. So whilst Amendment 4 deals with the question of reliefs, which I think should be subject to the affirmative procedure, I would be intending to bring an amendment at stage 3 to amend Section 78B of the Local Government Scotland Act 1975 to also apply that principle of switching from a negative to an affirmative instrument in relationship to the annual poundage rate. And I'd be interested in the Minister's views on that. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Any other members? No. Minister.
Thanks very much, Convener. And just very briefly to Andy Whiteman's opening remarks, I do accept that the debate has moved on considerably since last week about whether regulations setting out these reliefs should be subject to affirmative or negative procedures because of the repeal of Section 153. But I do think that's a discussion for another day. But the points I'm about to make are not valid if in the scenario that Section 153 repeal goes ahead. So I think I'd like to challenge the point, any suggestion or inference that non-domestic rates policy decisions are not subject currently to parliamentary scrutiny, and I make that point for two reasons. I think, firstly, that committee and Parliament do scrutinise legislation carefully, and non-domestic rate decisions have been set out as part of the Scottish Budget for a number of years and are subjected to extensive consultation and scrutiny throughout that process. And that gives Parliament and ratepayers a clear and explicit direction and indication of the government's policy intention, which was a key recommendation of the Barclay Review. And at the conclusion of the budget process, the Scottish Government routinely lodges 8 to 10 instruments to bring into effect various rates and reliefs. Those need to be considered and in force for the start of the new financial year. Now, those will largely contain very technical detail within the strategic boundaries set by the budget process, but I would suggest that the committee doesn't need me to appear before it and explain the detail of such, but I would be absolutely delighted to appear before the committee if they thought that was important to talk to the technical details in those instruments. That can be done without changing the current procedure. The committee can invite me to discuss a negative instrument if it wishes. So I don't see what the advantages of this amendment would be. It doesn't give the committee greater powers. The committee can scrutinise as it has always done. And so I don't quite see what's broken right now that needs to be fixed. And if it's changed simply for the sake of change, then I wouldn't be given to support this amendment. But I am very clear that if the committee wishes me to speak to any of the instruments that will inevitably be lodged and subjected to scrutiny, then I am always happy to accommodate the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy?
Thanks very much. I mean, there's an established practice, I think, in Parliament, certainly since I've been here, observing the way that primary legislation is enacted, that consideration is given both by the introducer of a bill and in more detail by the Delegated Powers Committee as to whether specific powers in legislation should be subject to affirmative and negative procedures. And they tend to be based around the significance and import of the measure concerned. And I take the Minister's point that under Section 153, there's a variety of reliefs. I mean, in March this year, we had the Non-Domestic Rates Telecommunication Installations Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019. Now, from memory, that was a fairly minor SSI. But we also had the Non-Domestic Rates Levying Scotland Regulations, which provided for this current financial year's small business bonus scheme, which is, as I say, £270 million of public expenditure. So just as a matter of principle, were we to be drafting legislation today that gave the powers that are contained in Section 153 of the 94 Act, we would be subjecting these reliefs to the affirmative procedure. Now, I'm quite happy not to move this particular Amendment 4 on the basis that not all secondary legislation that flows from 153 would be appropriate for the affirmative procedure, because some of it is minor and technical. But I disagree with the Minister when she says that all these instruments are minor and technical. 250 or 270 million pounds of public expenditure, not minor or technical. That's a major commitment of public finance. And this year, for example, it altered the thresholds. Just to finish, I will just let you in. It altered the thresholds. And the Minister says that this is part of a bigger debate in the budget. Well, to be blunt, it might be part of a bigger debate in the budget, but specific taxes, notably income tax, are subject to a separate resolution. And the Minister also said that she's very keen to come here at any time the committee likes. Well, I welcome that, but that shouldn't be subject to a member having to lay a motion to annul, which is a very clumsy way. I will, and then I'll come to Mr Simpson.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would have thought the committee can invite me without you needing to resort to those actions.
Yeah, absolutely. The committee will not hesitate to invite the Minister along when we want to scrutinise the Minister. That's not the point here. We're talking about legislation. We're talking about Parliament passing legislation. In this case, specifically on the levying regulations, an instrument conferring power on ministers to spend £270 million. My mere point is that shouldn't be a negative instrument, it should be an affirmative instrument. But in recognition of the fact that Section 153 provides that there should be a variety of instruments, some of substantial financial consequences and some more minor, I'm not going to move Amendment 4, but I would want to speak to the Minister between now and stage 3 so that things like the Small Business Bonus Scheme or any other relief with a quantum of over a certain threshold should be an affirmative instrument. I'll take Mr Simpson.
Well, I may not have to say anything if you're not going to move, Mr Whiteman. Had you been moving, I would have been supporting you, having heard the various contributions. But you know, because I do think what you're saying is really important. We're dealing with large amounts of money, and that simply shouldn't be dealt with by the negative procedure. You know, parliamentary scrutiny and the level of parliamentary scrutiny is very important. It's technical stuff, but it matters. So I think I'd take on board what Andy Whiteman's saying. If he changes his mind and moves, I'll support him. If he doesn't, that's fine. We can look at it for stage 3.
Okay, thank Mr Simpson for that. In view of that ringing endorsement of Amendment 4, I think I may move it, but I'm merely putting on record that you know, there will have to be an adaptation of that before stage 3, because I do recognise that some of these instruments are technical. But having said that, there's practice, as the Minister correctly pointed out, there's practice that all of these instruments come as a bundle, and they came to us on the 20th of March this year. And they all come then because they have to be in place for the start of the new financial year. They all come in a bundle. So in practice, if the levying regulations, which were the Small Business Bonus Scheme, were an affirmative procedure, the Minister would be here anyway. So in a sense, it wouldn't make much difference. But I do think, as Graham Simpson said, and he has some authority in this regard, I suppose, as convener of the Delegated Powers Committee, if we're spending public money, large sums of public money, we're changing that quantum each year, we're changing thresholds, we're changing rates. I totally accept that that can be subject of parliamentary debate and more broad debate. But on this very specific legislative provisions, that should be subject to an affirmative procedure. It's a very, very straightforward point. And certainly the non-domestic rates Scotland order should be as well, although, as I concede, I don't have an amendment to that effect. But I'm not sure if the Minister was agreeing. I don't think she was agreeing that should be affirmative or not. But I will be bringing forward an amendment to that effect at stage 3.
No, if you're finished.
Okay, you're finished.
I am finished.
Yes, and are you going to press or withdraw?
I'll press Amendment 4. What the hell?
Okay, the question is, Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Those in favour of Amendment 4? It's 4. Those opposed, 2. Amendment 4 is agreed to. Call Amendment 52 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 23. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. Question is, Amendment 52 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Amendment 52 is agreed to. I call Amendment 53 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 53 and speak to all amendments. Thank you. Minister.
What? This
Minister
is Group
to-
26. Is that right?
So,
Yep. Group Friends, thanks very much, Convener. So in terms of these amendments, they relate to civil penalties for failure to comply with assessor information notices. And before I go into detail about each amendment, I'd like to emphasise the importance, and I think it was identified by the committee as well, of information sharing between the ratepayer and the assessor. To quote the Scottish Assessors Association in a letter to the committee dated the 25th of October, and I quote, "The non-domestic rate system is entirely based upon accurate information being returned to the assessor in time to ensure that assessor can arrive at the correct valuations. Such a process is essential to allow ratepayers to be confident in their assessment and to reduce the time and cost of dealing with proposals and appeals," and I end quote. There's a recognition amongst the majority of stakeholders of the need to reform the current appeals process, and we're doing that, but we also need to build trust in the system overall. And one way to do that is to require that assessors provide more information to people so that they can understand their valuations better, and the bill gives ministers the power to do that. Another way to increase confidence in the system is to increase the accuracy of valuations. And in evidence submitted to this committee for an evidence session on 26th of April 2017, the Scottish Assessors Association highlighted that in licensed premises sector, for instance, little over 50% of the rental and turnover information had been returned. Despite this, 3/4 of the 74,000 revaluation appeals for this cycle resolved to date saw no change in their rateable value. So if information return rates go up, I am confident that the accuracy of valuations could be even higher, reducing the need to appeal over time. I'll only speak in detail about the key amendments in this group, the others being technical and consequential to the others. So Amendment 53 responds to the Scottish Assessors Association's request made during Stage 1 evidence to this committee that the period for compliance with an assessor information notice be shortened from 56 days to 28 days. Amendments 54 and 56 to 58 amend... Yeah.
Thanks, Minister. I just want to ask about the difference between 56 and 28. So if we're giving people just 28 days to respond, to me, that doesn't sound like an awful long time. You know, people could be on holiday, for example. You could easily miss that 28-day deadline. 56 days is obviously double that. But I just wonder how you've come up with 28 days, because I could easily see a situation where people, through no fault of their own, don't meet that deadline.
Yeah, thanks to the member. And of course, we originally put in 56 days, and the assessors themselves were the ones that highlighted why that would be a serious issue in light of the need to get that information up front. And I go back to that point that I think in one sector in particular, a little over 50% of information had been returned, which is just not acceptable when you're trying to have the appropriate information to make a judgment on. And it's no wonder that appeals are so high when valuations are reflecting the poor provision of information. In terms of 28 days, it is a judgment call on the basis that businesses should be able to turn that information around within a month. Businesses should probably be working to a month anyway in terms of providing that information. One would hope that it's information that they have already. It's not new information. I think that this is certainly borne out by some comments that sometimes information is withheld intentionally in order to be able to provide it later on at an appeal process. Yep.
Yeah. I don't think there's a right and wrong here. I think that it is finding the balance. But I can just see situations where small businesses, for instance, you know, we're not big businesses, but small businesses where the owners of those businesses might well be away. They could take a month's holiday, for example, if they're lucky, and they won't be able to meet that 28-day deadline. I wonder whether there's I accept your fundamental point, but whether there's a balance to be struck between 28 and 56.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sort of dead set on this, but I think in the context of 3 yearly revaluations and a 1-year tone date, 1 month really matters. So assessors will only have 12 months from 2024 to make revaluations. They can't really afford to sit and wait for 3 months for that information. And whilst I take your point, businesses are usually working to 1 month for a whole host of other deadlines as well. And I think it would be probably very poor practice if, knowing that a revaluation is coming down the line and that there will be the expectation to provide information, that they don't factor that in and go on holiday for a considerable period of time. It is a judgment call. We're obviously working with very small businesses as well as very substantial businesses. And I think the substantial businesses, apart from anything, should not be sitting on information for 3 months. I think 1 month certainly was what the assessors identified as being appropriate, and assessors do use their judgment. They don't leave their judgment behind when it comes to tailoring what the response is to particularly small businesses. Yeah.
This point. So given that it's a judgment call, is this something that, should this pass today, is this something that perhaps you're willing to enter into discussions on for stage 3?
I mean, I would need to see some really substantial, concrete evidence to contradict what Scottish Assessors Association are calling for in this regard and what's been borne out of comments made by assessors and businesses themselves. I don't think we can underestimate how profoundly important it is to deal with the appeal system in light of the fact we're moving to 3 yearly revaluations. Businesses en masse welcome the move to 3 yearly revaluations. It will not happen if we don't get the appeals right, and we can't get the appeals right if we don't get information sharing right, and we can't get information sharing right unless we give assessors the powers. Yes.
Thank the Minister for taking information. So this is a question. We've just passed an amendment in relationship to, well, I think we have. I think, yeah, we did. Electronic communications in relationship to paying. My understanding is that assessors who are requesting information here, that amendment doesn't apply to this. I mean, should we not be moving to a situation where we have a valuation role, which is partially digital at the moment, where you're communicated with electronically, you're asked to log on to your valuation, and you enter the information that's requested, which is basically how much rent you're paying this year. I mean, it should take no more than 48 hours. But to clarify, what the assessor information notice here says a notice in writing. So I wonder if you can clarify whether, in fact, you envisage, or indeed whether the bill provides powers that this could all be done.
Yep, so we will now have the option to move all aspects of this process to electronic systems. That's certainly where I would like us to end up with, that it's not a case of letters being posted and perhaps lost for some time, but everything that can be electronic is electronic. So the previous amendment and the thrust of this bill basically makes the default electronic with the obvious need for caveats and options. So we, in terms of your vision for it being electronic, that's certainly where I want to be. In terms of, under Group 20...
You'll have a chance to come in, Andy, so
okay.
Could we let the Minister do a bit and then everybody else can come in before the Minister winds up?
Thank you, Convener. Amendments 54 and 56 to 58 amend the civil penalty amounts. So I should point out that with the amounts currently set out in the bill, it would take a property with a rateable value of £7 million, for instance, nearly 1,000 years for a penalty to reach its rateable value at the upper limit. And that does not seem commensurate with an annual rates bill of £3.6 million. So in particular, we must consider that withholding information could potentially mean saving thousands of pounds or tens of thousands of pounds due to the rateable value being lower than it would have been if the assessor had had that information. So I recognise that penalties must be appropriate and commensurate with the potential savings that could arise from withholding information from assessors. Moving to a percentage basis rather than absolute amounts for the penalty allows for this. And so that's why Amendment 56 replaces the first penalty with the greater of £200 and 1% of the rateable value of the lands and heritages concerned for the day on which the penalty notice is given. It also specifies the penalty as £1,000 where the property has not yet entered the roll. something the bill did not previously provide for. And Amendment 57 increases the time frame for provision of information from 21 to 28 days before a person is liable to a further penalty after the first penalty notice was given, I think, which is a point of fairness. Amendment 58 replaces the second penalty amount with the greater of £1,000 and 20% of the rateable value of the lands and heritages concerned for the day on which the penalty notice is given, or £10,000 where the lands and heritages concerned are not entered on the roll yet. Amendment 59 specifies that if the person fails to comply with the original information notice within 56 days of being liable to a penalty, they become liable to a further penalty equal to the rateable value of the property, or £50,000 where the lands and heritages are not yet entered on the roll. And Amendment 66 ensures that an assessor must pay any money recovered under the penalties to the Scottish Consolidated Fund. It specifies that an assessor may do so after deduction of reasonable expenses incurred in relation to the giving of penalty notices under Section 18 and the collection of penalties. It further enables Scottish ministers by regulation to make provision about the expenses that may be deducted and provide that these regulations are to be subject to the negative procedure. I move Amendment 53, but happy to answer any questions on this.
Okay, thank you. Just before I let Andy in, can I just remind everybody that when the mover has spoken, you have your chance to ask questions of the Minister. It's not a question and answer section with the Minister, and any interventions, please make sure that they're short and to the point. Andy?
Yes, thanks. Just on my previous point about electronic communications, it's my understanding that the assessor information notices can be electronic under the provisions we've just passed. That's fine. It's just a question here, and forgive me if I'm reading this incorrectly, but in terms of Amendment 56, so this is where if we go to a 28-day period in Section 14, Amendment 56.
Okay.
And so this is for the purposes of Section 2B. So my point is, if you am I correct in understanding that if you fail to respond within 28 days or 56 days, depending on where we go with that, a ratepayer who has a rateable value of £3 million would be liable for a fine of £300,000?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's...
Minister, you know that you can just take these things in and then
answer at the end, sorry.
Yeah. Right. So again, so it doesn't go into a question and answer.
I'm just wondering if that's proportionate. I mean, I understand the arguments the Minister has put forward in relationship to assessor information notices and moving to 28 days, etc. I just wonder whether a £300,000 fine for being a day late on a £3 million property. On this building, the Parliament, I think that would be a £700,000 fine. It's a genuine question. I just wonder whether that's proportionate where there's no intention to delay or anything. I'll just leave that there.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks for allowing me to ask the Minister some questions earlier, because I think the answers were useful and it's helped to clarify things in my own mind, because I was genuinely wrestling with Amendment 53, the balance between 56 days and 28 days. I don't think that balance has been struck. I think I'll be opposing 53 at this point. Hopefully we can get some movement at stage 3. On the amendments which Andy Whiteman's just spoken about, 56 through to 59, which deals with penalties. Again, that's a judgment call. What's the balance? What's the right balance? And I've heard what Mr. Whiteman said. I'm quite taken by what he said about, that the potential fines being out of kilter. The Scottish Property Federation has made the same point to the committee. So I think at the minute, I'm probably swayed against these amendments.
Would the member take a brief intervention on that point?
I will. I had just finished, but I'm aware that I prevented
unerringly.
Miss Ewing from speaking earlier. So
I was just really to pose a
would
question
love to hear from her.
Thank you. I was just really, if the member is not keen on the approach put forward by way of these amendments, and we did take some evidence on these issues, you know, and there was an enthusiasm to just try to move this system into a different space where it worked much more effectively with incentives and penalties and so forth for not complying. What level of penalty would the member feel was satisfactory, if not this approach?
I haven't got any figures in mind. I have genuinely been wrestling with this one. I just think, at the moment, I think that these feel too high, but I haven't got any particular figures in mind.
Sorry, but to be fair, Andy's example was quite an extreme example, wasn't it? I mean, it's a legit example, I don't mean that, but it was quite an extreme example. And we did, in stage one, we had this sort of problem, didn't we? We all agreed that something had to be done, we just weren't quite sure what it was.
No, I agree, convener, and something has to be done. But it is, as we've discussed earlier, it's striking the balance.
Okay, I'm not sure if that helps at all, Minister, but...
It does, and am I allowed to respond now? Yes. I agree with all members that these are a judgment call, and I want to emphasise, I think, what would have come through to the committee in evidence, and certainly I think is the core issue in the non-domestic rate system, and it is the withholding of information and the appeals. And I think if you look at the figures and the significant percentage of ratepayers that withhold information that assessors then have to chase and look for and go after when they're busy enough as it is, I think something has got to be done. And I think, again, that if we're to move to 3 yearly revaluations, then we are unable to deliver on that if assessors do not have stronger powers in relation to information sharing. Moving to 28 days or 50 to 60 days or anything in between is actually irrelevant if there aren't penalties or consequences for not providing that information in time. The point I'd make about these penalties is these penalties are not intended to be revenue raising. If these penalties were intended to be revenue raising, they'd probably be much lower, because it's more likely that ratepayers would make a judgment call as to whether they wanted to pay or withhold information. But these are intended to be effective in delivering what the assessors have called for and said is critical for them to be able to deliver their role, and that is to get the information they need in plenty of time. Equally, I think it's important to state that assessors have powers to remit or to reduce any penalties, and penalties can be appealed to the Valuation Appeal Committee. So that does give ratepayers access to justice as well, and assessors are very good at using their judgment when it comes to ratepayers. Now, in terms of these penalties amount, they may seem high, but it should be noted that if you take, for example, the large business supplement with a poundage at 51.6%, large properties pay their rateable values worth in tax in less than 2 years. And withholding information can lead to a significantly lower rateable value in many cases. The question for those wishing to avoid tax in this way is it better to pay the penalty and withhold the information, or to share the information and pay their rates bill? We want... Yeah. It
just occurred to me as well that, looking at this issue, and we did take, quite a bit of evidence on this at stage one, this is surely an issue, Minister, of fairness, because for those people who actually do comply, they provide the information, but yet they see others, for whatever reason, not doing so. Surely that brings in a key element of fairness to those who comply.
It does bring in a key issue of fairness. It becomes an issue of fairness in the appeal system as well, because my priority in reforming the appeal system is to make sure that those who really deserve a reduction in their rates bill gets the access to justice that they need. At the moment, bluntly, and this is borne out by the figures, there is a sense in which people withhold information knowing that they will then be able to provide that additional information at the appeals process and get their appeal reducing their rates bill. I would much rather that people provided full information, which they should be able to do anyway, and then those that deserve access to justice and need to see their valuation reduced can do so through an appeal system that is not clogged up. So for me, this is about access to justice. It's about fairness. These penalties are intended to be effective, not to raise revenue. And the only way they'll be effective is if they are significant in nature, while still allowing for mitigating circumstances where assessors will have the opportunity to reduce and remit.
Short intervention. Does that mean then, for example, if a small business, which was mentioned earlier on, is struggling to make the deadline, makes you aware that they're going to, makes the assessors aware they're going to make the deadline, they could get that extra period, a week or whatever it is, to get their figures in?
That would be for the assessors to judge, but that possibility exists, that assessors right now, in terms of the way the system works, usually know their ratepayers inside out. They have a relatively good relationship with them, and if you look at the way that we're reforming the appeal system more generally, we're actually formalising what informally takes place already, which is casual conversations between assessors that then moves to a formal appeals system. So assessors know their ratepayers and would be able to make that call. I should also note that over 40% of properties get small business bonus as well. So, we ultimately want a penalty amount that reflects or is on the same scale as the rates bill for the system to be effective. And that means those that have a substantial rates liability are paying substantially more in penalties than those that are smaller and should not be paying the same level. So for me, this is about an effective appeal system, a fair appeal system. I know that those figures might cause some alarm, but they're not designed to raise revenue, in other words, to get as much money out as possible. They're designed to make it really clear that we expect ratepayers to comply with their duties to share information.
Okay, thank you.
I'm finished, but yeah.
I mean, but you're indicating 28 days. Is that what will be the time scale? Or, as you've indicated there, an assessor has a knowledge of what their businesses are doing, but if it's 28 days, it will clamp down on 28 days.
So there's two elements, I think, to your question. Amendment 57 increases the time frame for provision of information from 21 to 28 days before a person is liable to further penalty after the first penalty notice was given. The previous amendment, which I think Graham Simpson was talking about, was whether to move from 56 days to 28 days. And that's a response to requests that the period of compliance with an assessor information notice be shortened. So there's two discussions here about timeframes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you're pressing your amendment.
Pressing.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 53 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Okay. Those in favour of Amendment 53? 4. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 53 is therefore agreed to. The question is that Section 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The question is that Section 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. I call Amendment 96 in the name of Sarah Boyack and a group on its own. Sarah Boyack to move and speak to Amendment 96.
Thank you, Convener. I've just been listening very carefully to that previous discussion about timescales, and the point of Amendment 96 is to give companies more leeway in notifying their change of circumstances. And the current requirement is 21 days, which does seem incredibly short. So the addition of an additional 21 days would take you from 3 weeks effectively to 6 weeks to ensure that companies going through changes in their business don't inadvertently fail to notify a change of circumstances. So one of the issues I was keen to get from the Minister is assurances about increased communication following this bill about the requirements companies face and ensuring that they are aware of the changes being proposed, when they will take effect, much in sense of the same way that I had some points of clarification about independent schools. There's something about all this legislation for a lot of businesses going to be a huge change, so there's something about making sure that they are all up to speed and that they know what these changes are. So really the point of this amendment is to encourage businesses to comply by giving them a bit more time to get the notice organised, and for those reasons I'll move the amendment and I hope colleagues will support it.
Okay, thank you. Graham?
Thanks, Convener. I'll be supporting this amendment, basically for the reasons that I outlined when I spoke on Amendment 53. I think it provides the right balance. 21 days is too short. 42 seems about right. Maybe that's where we could get to with the Minister on her Amendment 53. But I'll certainly support Amendment 96.
Okay. Any others? No? Minister?
Could I firstly just speak to the substance of Sarah Boyack's first point around supporting ratepayers in advance of these changes? And I do think it's important to state that I have had extensive consultation meetings, engagement with most of the representative bodies, from FSB to Scottish Retail Consortium and many others, too numerous to name probably right now, throughout the process. So that sense of giving information up front and supporting them to support the members, I think is a job I've taken very seriously, and I know the committee has also had a lot of consultation. So I would like to think that these changes are high up on people's agenda, and they know that these changes are coming, not least because a lot of them are very welcome to ratepayers, particularly that move to 3 yearly revaluations and getting appeals right. In terms of this amendment moving the time frame, I mean, notwithstanding my earlier comments about information sharing, which is the most critical element of this bill, I think it's important that local authorities have accurate, up-to-date information, but that also ratepayers have the opportunity to make changes. These changes could be quite diverse in nature. There's a whole host of different changes, some of which are more profound than others. Up-to-date information certainly enables appropriate reliefs to be applied. It's not just about what the tax liability, it's also about applying reliefs. And I think those are important factors in ensuring that all ratepayers contribute their fair share to the cost of the public services as well. Most ratepayers do what's asked of them. Most of them comply with requirements, but there are those that do not. And that could be failing to notify a local authority of a change in tenant, or a failure to respond to direct information requests from a local authority. And so the introduction of a civil penalty will empower local authorities to seek better compliance. I note the comments that Sarah Boyack has made. I do think this is a point of judgment. Ratepayers will face different circumstances. They are different in size apart from anything else. And an argument can be made for a ratepayer to be given a longer but still clearly defined timescale. And in the spirit of not rejecting all good ideas that come forth from the committee, I'd be delighted to support this amendment.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, would you like to wind
In that case, thank you, colleagues. I'd better press this amendment in my name. and I think it is that point of judgment, and in the context of trying to provide more information to everybody, so that those who can comply faster will do that, but those for whom they can't, they will still comply, but they have a little bit more time to do that. Thank you, colleagues.
Although you could have withdrawn after the spirit of confusion over there earlier on. Okay, so the question is that Amendment 96 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Section 18, I call amendments 54 to 63, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move amendments 54 to 63 on block.
Moved on block.
I ask whether any member objects to a single question being put on amendments 54 to 63 on block. Yes. I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, I did indeed. Okay. I therefore call amendment 54. The question is amendment 54 be... Sorry. All right, okay, sorry, my apologies. Minister, could you move?
Moved.
Amendment 54, thank you. Okay. The question is that Amendment 54 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 55 be agreed to. Are we all agreed then? Yes, thank you, Minister. Thank you. The question is that 56, Amendment 56 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Okay. Those in favour of Amendment 56? 4. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 56 is agreed to. Amendment 57, thank you. The question is that Amendment 57 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Agreed. The question is that Amendment 58 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Right, okay. Those in favour of Amendment 58? 4. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 58 is agreed to.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 59 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Those in favour of Amendment 59? 4. Those opposed? 2. Amendment 59 is agreed to.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 60 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Amendment 60 is agreed to.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 61 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 62 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. And
Moved.
Finally, thank you. The question is that Amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes, thank you. I call Amendment 97 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 86. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 97 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay. Those in favour of Amendment 97? Okay, 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 97 is therefore false. The question is that Amendment 9. The question is that Section 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I call Amendment 64 in the name of the Minister, already debated with
Moved.
Amendment 53. The question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Agreed. I call Amendment 65 in the name of the Minister, already debated.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Amendment 65 agreed to. Call Amendment 98 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 86. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 98 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 98? 1. Those opposed? 5. Amendment 98 is not agreed to. The question is that Section 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I call Amendment 66 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 53. Minister,
Moved.
to move forward. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 66 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I call Amendment 99 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 86. Sarah Boyack, to move or not move?
Just trying to find this. Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 99 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 99? 1. Those opposed? 5. 99 falls. The question is that Section 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. I call Amendment 67 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendment 69. Minister, to move Amendment 67 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener, and I move these amendments in my name. Amendment 69, if I could start with that one, provides that Scottish ministers may make provision by regulations on the collection of civil penalties imposed under Section 20 for failure to comply with local authority information notices and failure to notify changes in circumstances. This amendment provides ministers with the power by regulations to, for instance, enable councils to handle the collection of civil penalties in non-domestic rates in the same way as they do in council tax. In council tax, where the person liable to pay the penalty is also liable to pay council tax, local authorities have the option to add the penalty to the council tax liability. The local authority can then collect the penalty along with council tax due in exactly the same manner. This is an efficient and a cost-effective approach, and councils may wish to have the power to do the same with non-domestic rates, and hopefully that is a system that is familiar, certainly, to those who pay council tax. The collection of penalties, including around the use of demand notices, services of notices, suspension of collection during appeals, and potential offset of penalties collected if an appeal is successful, and is an administrative matter, and it should fall to be dealt with in regulations. And as this is a complex area of law, it may be necessary for those regulations to be able to modify different acts in order to achieve the desired change, hence the extent of the powers provided for in this amendment. These regulations will be subject to the affirmative procedure if they add to, if they replace, or if they omit any part of the text of an act. Otherwise, they'll be subject to a negative procedure. And I believe that strikes the balance, which was highlighted in the committee earlier this morning, between parliamentary scrutiny and administrative adaptability. Amendment 67 is simply a consequential provision as a result of Amendment 69. So I move Amendment 67.
Thank you. Does anybody wish to contribute? Okay, Minister, would you like to move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 67 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Thank you. Call Amendment 68 in the name of the Minister already debated. Minister, move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 68 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Thank you. I call Amendment 100 in the name of Sarah Boyack, already debated with Amendment 86. Sarah Boyack, move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. The question is that Section 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. I call Amendment 69 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 67.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 69 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 101 in the name of Sarah Boyack and a group on its own. Sarah Boyack to move and speak to Amendment 101.
Thank you, Convener. The technical term for a business disappearing and then reborn is phoenixing, and this aim behind this Amendment 101 is to avoid people paying tax deliberately, which is not acceptable. I welcome the support from Scottish Land and Estates for my amendment, as it gives local authorities the ability to recover rates lost through these means, and they comment that they support the principle of increasing fairness and ensuring a level playing field amongst taxpayers and see it as a positive addition to this bill. So this amendment would provide the necessary legal tools to empower local authorities to pursue any party for payment of non-domestic rates where it can be shown that they were involved in the evasion, while protecting other parties that were not involved in the avoidance of non-domestic rates. I move the amendment in my name. Thank you, Convener.
Does anybody else want to contribute? No, Minister.
Thank you, Convener. At the beginning, I think, of our session last week, Sarah Boyack asked me for the difference between Amendment 101 and Amendment 84 in the name of Andy Whiteman. And I should point out that I'd said to Andy Whiteman that I'd be happy to have discussions around his amendment. So it may be the case that there's scope to have discussions with Sarah Boyack as well in advance of stage 3. As I mentioned last week, I'm a firm believer in tackling avoidance. That's why we introduced Part 4 of the bill to allow ministers to tackle it in the most effective way possible. As it stands just now, the bill requires that we consult on these regulations with assessor and local authority representatives. And I think it's important that we do that, because that means that there's greater input from those who administer the system than through an amendment to the bill. Yep.
An intervention on that specific point. In a previous amendment this morning, you said that assessors know the ratepayers, and I'm bringing this forward amendment because there are times when the assessors really do not know the ratepayers, when people are deliberately trying to avoid the process. So could you just pick up that point about they don't in all circumstances know those ratepayers?
Absolutely, and I think that's a fair point. And when I made that comment, I meant that, you know, there is an extent to which assessors understand the nature of the ratepayers, so can therefore reduce or remit penalties. But the member is quite right. I should point out, though, that this amendment is not about assessors, it's about councils, and I think it's important to make that distinction. In terms of my approach to general anti-avoidance regulations, the consultative route is certainly my preferred approach for considering whether to provide councils with additional powers in relation to property owners and the rates liability for their property. I believe that we've found the right balance with Part 4 of the bill and the anti-avoidance tackling powers it creates. And therefore, at the moment, I certainly wouldn't be supportive of Sarah Boyack's amendment. But I've committed to considering the points of discussion from last week around Amendment 84. As worded, Amendment 101 in Sarah Boyack's name is quite broad and certainly needs further specification or answering specific questions. For example, how far back could you seek rates from the owner? I'd be happy to go into more information about my perceived difference between 101 and 84, but as it stands just now, whilst I'm happy to discuss Amendment 84 and 101 if the members choose to work together, I don't see a need for 101 through this process in an amendment. I would rather allow local authorities and assessors to inform the approach we take on anti-avoidance.
Okay, thank you very much. You wind up.
Yeah, the Minister both reassured me and worried me a bit because she said on one hand this was too broad, but she was already ruling out certain factors that I think are quite important in terms of this. It's not just making the statement about it, it's making sure that local authorities do have the necessary legal tools, and I think you were calling into question whether they needed those legal tools alongside assessors. So that worried me a bit. I would, yes.
I think we're very clear, and it was a key part of Barclay that there should be increased powers around general anti-avoidance regulations. So we're absolutely committed to that. The only point of difference I have with this amendment is how we do that, and I would rather local authorities and assessors shape that through a consultative approach than we just put an amendment on the face of the bill. So I think I completely get where Sarah Boyd is coming from. I agree with the intention. I just don't think Amendment 101 is the way to do it.
Okay, on that basis, I won't move it at this stage and reserve the right to come back at stage 3, having discussed it with yourself and Andy Whiteman, depending on the result of those conversations. But I don't want to drop the issue because I think it's an important point that we need to firm up on before we get to stage 3.
Okay,
thank
so
you.
You're withdrawing it at this point?
At this point, thank you.
Sarah Boyack wishes to withdraw her amendment. Does any member present have any objection to the amendment being withdrawn? Okay, thank you very much. The question is that section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. The question is that sections 24, 25 and 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 70 in the name of the Minister and a group on its own. Minister, to move and speak to Amendment 70.
Thank you, Convener. And this flows quite neatly on from our previous conversation, because our response to the Delegated Power and Law Reform Committee Stage 1 report said that the Scottish Government would bring forward amendments at stage 2 in response to several recommendations that were made by that committee. And Amendment 70 sets out when the Scottish Ministers must notify the Scottish Parliament that a consultation on draft anti-avoidance regulations has issued. It provides that it must be as soon as is reasonably practical after the consultation is begun. That's what the DPLR committee asked for, and that's what we're providing through this amendment. So I move Amendment 70.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? No. The question is that Amendment 70 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Right. The question is that Section 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that Section 28 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Thank you. I call Amendment 71 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 86.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 71 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 72 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 86.
That's moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 72 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The question is that Section 29 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. I call Amendment 80 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 73. Graham Simpson, to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 80 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 80? 2. Those opposed to Amendment 80? 3. The Amendment 80 is not agreed. Oh,
I didn't vote on that one.
Okay. You're abstaining, yeah. And 1 abstention. So Amendment 80 falls. I call Amendment 81 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 81 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 81? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 81 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 82 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 82 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 82? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 82 is not agreed to. Call Amendment 83 in the name of Liz Smith, already debated with Amendment 73. Liz Smith to move or not move?
Yes, moved.
Thank you. Question is that Amendment 83 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Those in favour of Amendment 83? 2. Those opposed? 4. Amendment 83 is not agreed to. The question is that Section 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The question is that Section 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. And that ends stage 2. Yeah, you want to say something?
Point of order, convener. Yes. Earlier in the session, you used your casting vote. Now, as I understand it, conveners of committees are entitled to use their casting vote in the manner they see fit.
Yep.
And that's perfectly proper. But I think the committee would value some guidance from yourself, not today perhaps, but at a future meeting, about how you intend in general terms to exercise that power, because when you did exercise that power, you named a specific member of the committee who was absent, and you told us that you were voting in effect as a proxy. In effect, you were. I think the words were that Kenny Gibson would vote this way, and that's therefore.
Okay.
But the words are the words. They'll be in the official.
Would you like me to explain it?
Well, can I just finish the point of order?
It's not a point of order anyway. You don't have points of order at committee, but feel free to. Just on you go.
Oh, okay. You indicated that you were voting broadly in line with what you anticipated a member who was not present would vote. Now, if that's to be the position going forward, I think it'd be useful for us to know that, because in circumstances, for example, where I was absent and wasn't able to appoint a substitute, I would value knowing that that was the convener's intention, so that I could inform the conveners to what my intentions were. Having said that, the effect of the use of the casting vote was consistent with the principle that the casting vote is cast to maintain the status quo. So the effect of your casting vote this morning was no different. But I'm just wondering if in future you could give some guidance. And as a further just point of note, earlier in this meeting I said that 1% of 3 million was 300,000. That's wrong. It's 30,000 for the record. Thank you.
Okay, Graham.
Convener, I'll speak as a fellow convener. Conveners are able to use their vote, their casting vote, if it comes to that, as they see fit. I think you made a slip of the tongue, convener. I don't think you meant to imply that you were using a proxy vote. Clearly, you're not using a proxy vote. It's a casting vote, and you can vote whichever way you see fit. And I think on that occasion it went against me, but that is your prerogative.
Okay.
As it is for any convener.
I thank you for that. The reason I said what I said was basically just to make it clear that I wasn't voting in terms of the status quo. I was voting in the way I thought was appropriate to vote at that time. You're right, probably shouldn't mention Kenny's name, but I voted in the way that I thought was appropriate as convener. I have the right to vote in whichever way I want. The solution to not having a casting vote is for people to turn up at committee. That would probably be the ideal scenario. But as was said by Graham, and as the regulations say, my casting vote is my casting vote, and at committee I can deal with it in whatever way I want. Okay. Now can I say, and that ends stage 2 consideration of the bill. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Thank you.
Can you suspend?
And I suspend the meeting. Thank you. No, we're on private session, aren't we? No, we're not. Right, back on. Agenda item 4 is consideration of a negative instrument 393 as listed on the agenda. It is laid under the negative procedure, which means its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been laid. Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument at its meeting on 26 November 2019 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Do members have any comments on the instrument? No. Okay. I invite the committee, therefore, to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument. Are we agreed? Thank you. Now we can close the meeting. Thank you.